Her mother smiled warmly at the Duke and said, "Charlotte is a sweet girl, Your Grace, but she has never been burdened by too much learning. Reading has always been rather difficult for her." The lie settled over the drawing room as gently as falling snow. No one challenged it. No one even looked surprised. Charlotte Whitmore lowered her eyes to her teacup and said nothing. Across the room, Nathaniel Ashcroft, Duke of Ravenshire, merely inclined his head with polite indifference. To him, it was likely a meaningless piece of information offered during an ordinary afternoon call. To Charlotte, it was the latest stone added to a wall her mother had spent years building around her. London, spring of 1864. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows of Whitmore House in Mayfair. The grey afternoon light filtered through crystal chandeliers and reflected from polished silver trays carried by silent servants. A fire crackled in the marble hearth, casting a warm glow across the elegant drawing room where several distinguished guests had gathered for tea. Lady Margaret Whitmore presided over the occasion with practiced grace. At 48, she possessed the type of beauty that had sharpened rather than faded with age. Her chestnut hair remained fashionable. Her posture remained perfect. Her smile remained carefully measured. She knew precisely how to command a room without appearing to do so. Beside her sat Olivia Whitmore, her younger daughter and undeniable favourite. At 21, Olivia had inherited her mother's striking features and her talent for attracting attention. She laughed at the proper moments, tilted her head just so, and knew exactly how to make gentlemen feel clever. Charlotte sat several feet away near the window. The placement was not accidental. It never was. She occupied the chair furthest from the centre of conversation, partially hidden behind a large arrangement of spring roses. Anyone glancing around the room might almost overlook her entirely. Charlotte preferred it that way. At least, she told herself she did. The truth was more complicated. She was 24 years old and had spent much of her life learning how to disappear. Not because she lacked intelligence. Not because she lacked confidence. But because every attempt to step forward had been quietly pushed back by the people closest to her. "Olivia has always been exceptional with languages," Lady Margaret was saying proudly. "She reads French with remarkable ease." Olivia offered a modest smile. "Mamma exaggerates." "Not at all." Lady Margaret turned toward the Duke. "Last month she translated an entire letter from Paris." Charlotte looked down before anyone could notice the flicker of amusement in her eyes. The letter in question had contained less than a dozen sentences. Olivia had needed assistance with half of them. Nathaniel Ashcroft accepted the information with the calm courtesy expected of a man in his position. He was 34 years old. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Impeccably dressed in dark blue evening attire. There was nothing flamboyant about him. His reputation alone filled whatever space he entered. The Duke of Ravenshire was known throughout England for his discipline, intelligence, and relentless sense of responsibility. His estates were among the most prosperous in the country. His judgment was trusted by ministers, bankers, and noblemen alike. Charlotte had heard stories about him for years. She had expected arrogance. Instead, she saw something else. Observation. He listened more than he spoke. He watched more than he revealed. That made him dangerous in a way society often underestimated. And Charlotte asked Lady Winifred Hastings, one of the guests. Surely she must have talents of her own. A brief silence followed. Charlotte felt it immediately. Her mother answered before anyone else could. Charlotte is kind-hearted. The smile never left Lady Margaret's face. She enjoys simple pursuits. Gardening. Sketching. Looking after household matters. Nothing too demanding. Charlotte maintained her pleasant expression. Years of practice made it effortless. "That sounds lovely," Lady Winifred replied. "Do you paint?" "A little," Charlotte answered. "She's being modest," Olivia interrupted brightly. Charlotte once spent an entire week drawing flowers. The remark sounded innocent. It was not. Several guests chuckled politely. Charlotte smiled as though she found it amusing too. Inside, however, something tightened. The conversation moved on. It always did. Yet she noticed something unexpected. Nathaniel Ashcroft was looking at her. Not openly. Not long enough to attract attention. Just briefly. Thoughtfully. As if he had noticed something beneath the surface of the exchange. Charlotte looked away first. Moments later, a servant entered carrying a silver tray. Fresh correspondence had arrived. Among the letters was a sealed packet delivered specifically for Lady Margaret. Her expression changed the instant she saw it. Most people would not have noticed. Charlotte did. The slight stiffening of her shoulders. The brief pause before she accepted the envelope. Concern flashed across her mother's features and vanished almost immediately. Interesting. Lady Margaret excused herself and crossed toward a smaller sitting area near the far side of the room. Charlotte watched discreetly. Her mother opened the letter. Read several lines. Folded it again. Then slipped it into her sleeve. Whatever the message contained, it was not pleasant. A few minutes later, tea concluded. Guests began drifting into smaller conversations. Musicians in the adjoining parlor prepared to perform. Charlotte finally escaped to the window overlooking the rainy street below. She welcomed the temporary solitude. You seem relieved. The voice startled her. She turned. The Duke stood beside her. Not close enough to violate propriety. Close enough to speak privately. Charlotte managed a composed smile. Do I? Slightly. That is disappointing. I was hoping my performance had been more convincing. A faint expression touched his face. Not quite a smile. Not quite amusement. Performance. An afternoon of polite conversation requires endurance. I cannot disagree. Charlotte glanced toward the gathering behind them. That is a dangerous admission from a duke. Then perhaps you should keep it confidential. She laughed softly. The sound surprised even her. Nathaniel studied her for a moment. Do you often hide near windows during social events? Only when there are no libraries available. The answer escaped before she could stop it. His eyebrow lifted slightly. You enjoy reading. Charlotte nearly laughed at the irony. Very much. For the first time, genuine curiosity appeared in his expression. Before he could respond, Olivia approached. Your Grace. Her voice was warm and effortless. Mamma was hoping to show you Father's collection of landscape paintings. The interruption was perfectly timed. Charlotte recognized the strategy instantly. Olivia rarely left opportunities unattended. Nathaniel glanced toward Charlotte. Then toward Olivia. Of course. He inclined his head politely and followed her. Charlotte remained by the window. Rain continued sliding down the glass in silver trails. She should have felt relieved. Instead, a strange disappointment lingered. It was foolish. The Duke was simply another visitor. Another powerful man passing briefly through their lives. Yet for a few moments, she had experienced something unusual. Someone had spoken to her as though her thoughts might be worth hearing. The sensation stayed with her long after the conversation ended. Later that evening, after dinner had concluded and the household settled into quiet routines, Charlotte slipped from her bedchamber carrying a candle. She moved carefully through the dim corridors until she reached a narrow staircase seldom used by guests. At the top was a small locked room beneath the roof. Most servants believed it contained old furniture. Only Charlotte knew otherwise. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Books filled every available space. Law volumes. Parliamentary records. Estate ledgers. Historical texts. Journals. Maps. Several tables overflowed with notebooks covered in her meticulous handwriting. This was her sanctuary. Her hidden world. Here, no one called her simple. Here, no one laughed politely while dismissing her abilities. Charlotte set down her candle and opened a thick legal volume. The familiar scent of paper and leather greeted her like an old friend. Outside, rain continued to fall over London. Inside, she lost herself among words. Hours passed unnoticed. Eventually she reached for a fresh notebook and began copying sections from a complicated inheritance statute she had borrowed weeks earlier. The work required concentration, precision, patience. She loved every moment of it. Somewhere after midnight, she paused and rubbed tired eyes. Her gaze drifted toward the window. The city beyond was dark and silent. Most of London slept. Yet Charlotte remained awake, studying laws that few women were expected to understand and fewer still were encouraged to discuss. She thought briefly of the Duke, of his questions, of the way he had listened. Then she dismissed the memory and returned to her work. She could not know that the sealed letter her mother had hidden that afternoon concerned a financial problem threatening the future of the Whitmore family. She could not know that a legal dispute involving land, inheritance, and a dangerous error in documentation was already moving toward their doorstep. And she certainly could not know that within days, the same Duke who had been told she could barely read would place a document before her that would change both of their lives forever. The following morning arrived beneath a pale grey sky that hung low over London like a blanket of mist. Charlotte Whitmore had been awake for nearly 3 hours before the rest of the household stirred. Dawn remained her favourite part of the day. During those quiet moments, before servants began moving through corridors and before her mother's expectation settled over the house, she could simply exist without performing a role. She sat alone in the breakfast room with a notebook open beside her untouched tea. Several pages were filled with observations copied from legal texts. Others contained her own thoughts written in a neat, disciplined hand. A small fire crackled nearby. Outside, carriage wheels rattled across damp cobblestones. Charlotte paused as she reviewed a complicated inheritance dispute she had been studying for weeks. The statute itself was not difficult. The challenge came from how often people misunderstood it. Lawyers argued over interpretations. Families spent years fighting over estates because a single sentence had been poorly drafted decades earlier. She found the subject fascinating. Most women of her acquaintance would have considered such reading unbearably dull. Charlotte considered it endlessly entertaining. The sound of footsteps approaching interrupted her concentration. She quickly closed the notebook. A moment later, her father entered the room. Edward Whitmore looked older than his 56 years. His hair had thinned noticeably during the past decade. Deep lines marked his face. Once he had possessed the confidence of a prosperous gentleman managing substantial family interests. Recently, however, something seemed diminished in him. Worry lingered in his expression even during ordinary conversations. "Good morning, Charlotte." "Good morning, Father." He smiled faintly and settled into the chair opposite her. "You are up early. I could say the same about you." Unfortunately, responsibility rarely sleeps. His attempt at humor fell flat. Charlotte noticed the dark circles beneath his eyes. "Is something troubling you?" she asked gently. For a moment he appeared tempted to answer honestly. Then caution returned. "Nothing that need concern you." Charlotte lowered her gaze. She had heard that phrase countless times throughout her life. Nothing that need concern you. Nothing that requires your attention. Nothing that you would understand. The irony never failed to sting. Edward reached for the morning paper. "The Duke of Ravenshire is expected to visit again this afternoon." Charlotte's fingers tightened slightly around her teacup. "Is he?" "Business regarding several neighbouring properties." Edward folded the newspaper. "A fortunate opportunity. His Grace possesses considerable influence." Charlotte nodded. "Indeed." Her father hesitated. "Lady Margaret is eager to make a favourable impression." That, Charlotte thought, was hardly surprising. Few families ignored opportunities to strengthen connections with one of England's most powerful dukes. Especially not families experiencing difficulties they preferred to keep hidden. Before she could reply, the door opened and Lady Margaret entered with Olivia close behind. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. It always did. Lady Margaret possessed a talent for directing attention without raising her voice. "There you are, Edward. I have been looking for you. Good morning." "Good morning." She accepted a cup of tea from a waiting servant. The Duke will arrive at 2 o'clock. Everything must be prepared properly. Edward nodded. Of course. Lady Margaret turned toward Charlotte. You will join us this afternoon. Charlotte blinked. I had assumed Olivia would be entertaining the guests. Olivia will. The answer came immediately. Nevertheless, your presence is expected. Charlotte recognized the hidden meaning. Be present. Be pleasant. Say little. She offered a polite smile. Naturally. Olivia settled gracefully into her chair. I understand the Duke recently purchased additional land in Hampshire. So I have heard, Charlotte replied. An excellent decision. The area has great potential. Olivia looked mildly surprised. You know something about land management? Lady Margaret answered before Charlotte could speak. Not really. Charlotte simply reads whatever happens to fall into her hands. The remark sounded harmless. It was not. Edward shifted uncomfortably. Charlotte maintained her composure. A dangerous habit. Quite. Lady Margaret smiled over the rim of her teacup. One never knows what confusion excessive reading might cause. Olivia laughed. Edward did not. Charlotte said nothing. The conversation moved elsewhere. Yet the familiar frustration lingered. Her mother did not simply underestimate her. She actively shaped how others perceived her. Every gathering. Every introduction. Every opportunity. The pattern never changed. Charlotte spent the remainder of the morning assisting with correspondence and household accounts. The work itself was straightforward. She completed it efficiently and returned the ledgers to the study before anyone noticed she had corrected several numerical errors. Shortly after noon, she crossed paths with a young footman carrying a stack of documents. One sheet slipped loose and drifted onto the floor. Charlotte bent to retrieve it. Her eyes automatically scanned the page before she handed it back. The document bore legal markings. Several names. Property references. Estate boundaries. Something about it felt oddly familiar. Where did this come from? She asked. His lordship's study, miss. Charlotte nodded and returned the paper. Yet curiosity remained. The description referenced parcels of land bordering properties associated with Ravenshire interests. Interesting. By 2 o'clock, Whitmore House had transformed into a showcase of refinement. Fresh flowers adorned every major room. Silver gleamed. Servants moved with heightened precision. Lady Margaret inspected every detail personally. Charlotte wore a modest blue afternoon gown. Elegant enough to satisfy expectations. Plain enough to avoid attracting notice. As instructed, she occupied a position near the edge of the drawing room when the Duke arrived. Nathaniel Ashcroft entered with the same calm authority she remembered from the previous day. He greeted her parents courteously. Exchanged pleasantries. Accepted tea. Nothing about his manner suggested a man conscious of his enormous influence. That quality alone made him more formidable than many noblemen Charlotte had encountered. She noticed something else as well. He appeared preoccupied. His attention occasionally drifted toward a leather portfolio resting beside him. Whatever business had brought him here, it clearly mattered. After several minutes of conversation, Edward Whitmore finally addressed the subject. Regarding the Ravenshire trust matter. Nathaniel nodded. Yes. He opened the portfolio and withdrew several documents. Charlotte remained where she was. She had no intention of intruding. Yet the moment the papers appeared, she recognized the format. Legal instruments. Property transfers. Trust amendments. Her pulse quickened slightly. Lady Margaret immediately redirected attention elsewhere. Charlotte dear, perhaps you might help Mrs. Turner select flowers for tomorrow's luncheon. The request arrived too quickly. Too conveniently. Charlotte understood at once. Her mother wanted her removed before business discussions began. Normally she would have obeyed without question. Today, however, something unexpected occurred. Nathaniel glanced up from the documents. Miss Whitmore need not leave on my account. Silence followed. Brief. Noticeable. Lady Margaret recovered first. You are very kind, Your Grace. However, these matters are terribly technical. I am aware. Nathaniel's tone remained pleasant. Still, I doubt Miss Whitmore will be distressed by the sight of paperwork. Charlotte lowered her gaze to hide her surprise. Edward looked uncertain. Olivia looked annoyed. Lady Margaret smiled. Of course. Yet the smile seemed slightly strained. Charlotte resumed her seat. The discussion continued. Property lines. Trust obligations. Historical claims. Financial responsibilities. Most listeners would have lost interest within minutes. Charlotte followed every word. Gradually she realized why Nathaniel appeared concerned. One of the trust documents contained inconsistencies. Small ones. Easy to overlook. Yet potentially significant. She could not examine the pages directly from her position across the room. Still, several details troubled her. The Duke continued speaking with Edward. Questions were raised. Answers exchanged. Lady Margaret occasionally attempted to steer conversation elsewhere. Nathaniel always returned to the subject. An hour passed. Eventually tea concluded. The documents disappeared back into the portfolio. Business would continue at a later meeting. Nathaniel rose to depart. As farewells were exchanged, he unexpectedly approached Charlotte. Miss Whitmore. Your Grace. I hope your reading material has improved since yesterday. The remark caught her off guard. Amusement flickered in his eyes. Genuine amusement. Charlotte found herself smiling. That depends entirely upon one's standards. And yours are high. Unreasonably so. An unfortunate burden. A lifelong affliction. For the first time, a visible smile appeared. It transformed his face completely. Not dramatically. Just enough to reveal warmth hidden beneath restraint. Then the moment ended. Good afternoon, Miss Whitmore. Good afternoon, Your Grace. He departed moments later. The sound of the front door closing echoed faintly through the house. Charlotte watched through the window as his carriage disappeared down the street. You seemed very comfortable speaking with His Grace. Lady Margaret's voice interrupted her thoughts. Charlotte turned. Her mother's expression remained pleasant. Too pleasant. We discussed books. Did you? Briefly. Lady Margaret studied her for several seconds. I trust you remember your position. The words were quiet. Precise. Familiar. Charlotte met her gaze. I do. Good. Lady Margaret smiled once more and left the room. Charlotte remained standing beside the window long after everyone else had gone. Her mother's warning was not new. Yet today it felt different. Because for the first time in years, someone outside her family had begun to notice contradictions. Someone intelligent. Observant. Difficult to deceive. And somewhere within the Duke's portfolio rested a collection of documents that troubled her more the longer she thought about them. She could not explain why. She only knew one thing with certainty. The next time those papers appeared before her, she intended to examine them closely. Very closely. 3 days later, London awoke beneath brilliant sunshine for the first time in nearly a week. Golden light spilled across Mayfair rooftops and transformed the city into something brighter and more hopeful than the grey world Charlotte Whitmore had watched from her window only days before. Yet despite the pleasant weather, tension lingered inside Whitmore House. It appeared in small ways. A servant carrying messages more frequently than usual. Her father spending long hours behind closed study doors. Her mother receiving visitors she would not identify. Individually, none of these details seemed remarkable. Together, they formed a pattern Charlotte could not ignore. She sat in the library shortly after 10 o'clock, reviewing a collection of estate records she had quietly borrowed from a neglected shelf. Most members of the household assumed she spent her mornings reading poetry or sketching landscapes. No one paid attention to the title she selected. That lack of attention had become one of her greatest advantages. She turned another page and paused. The handwriting looked familiar. Very familiar. Her eyes narrowed. Several references matched details she had overheard during the Duke's recent visit. The same trust. The same neighboring properties. The same disputed boundaries. Charlotte leaned forward. Suddenly a knock sounded at the door. She quickly closed the ledger. A maid entered. "Miss Charlotte, Lady Margaret requests your presence in the drawing room." Charlotte blinked. Immediately. "Yes, miss." Curiosity stirred. Her mother rarely summoned her without reason. Charlotte followed the maid downstairs. The moment she entered the drawing room, she understood. Nathaniel Ashcroft stood near the fireplace speaking with Edward Whitmore. Several unfamiliar gentlemen occupied nearby chairs. Legal professionals, judging by their appearance and manner. One elderly man held a thick portfolio stuffed with documents. Another carried rolled maps secured with ribbon. Charlotte slowed. This was not a social call. It was a working meeting. "Ah, Charlotte." Lady Margaret's smile appeared perfectly pleasant. "There you are." Charlotte offered greetings. Nathaniel acknowledged her with a polite nod. The lawyers did the same. "Miss Whitmore." "Your Grace. I trust your standards remain unreasonably high." A spark of amusement touched his eyes. Charlotte found herself smiling despite her surprise. "Regrettably, they have not improved." One of the older gentlemen chuckled softly. "An unfortunate condition." "Indeed," Nathaniel replied. "Apparently there is no known cure." The exchange lasted only seconds, yet Charlotte noticed something unsettling. Her mother's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She disliked these conversations. That fact alone made Charlotte wonder why. The meeting soon resumed. Lady Margaret attempted to guide Charlotte toward a seat near the far window. Once again she understood the message. Observe quietly. Remain invisible. Charlotte complied. She settled into a chair and opened a book, creating the appearance of disinterest while listening carefully. The discussion concerned Ravenshire lands located west of Hampshire. Several trusts established decades earlier governed ownership arrangements between neighboring estates. Unfortunately, portions of the documentation appeared contradictory. Conflicting language existed between original agreements and later amendments. What should have been straightforward had become increasingly complicated. Charlotte listened closely. The more she heard, the more concerned she became. Certain explanations did not align with the record she had studied. Several assumptions appeared dangerously flawed. Yet she remained silent. The lawyers continued debating technical details. Maps were unrolled. Figures reviewed. Dates compared. Nearly an hour passed. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of the solicitors removed a fresh document from his portfolio. "We believe this amendment resolves the issue, Your Grace." Nathaniel accepted the pages. "Explain." The solicitor adjusted his spectacles. "The amendment transfers administrative authority to the Trust Committee while preserving existing inheritance protections." Charlotte's attention sharpened immediately. Administrative authority. Trust Committee. Inheritance protections. The word sounded reassuring. Too reassuring. The solicitor continued speaking. Nathaniel studied the pages. Edward Whitmore leaned forward with interest. Charlotte's pulse quickened. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. She could not see the document clearly from across the room. Yet several phrases reached her ears. Enough phrases. Enough details. A cold realization began forming. The solicitor finished his explanation. Silence followed. Nathaniel reviewed the pages again. "You are confident?" "Entirely." Charlotte stared at the floor. Her mind raced through statutes. Clauses. Legal precedents. Interpretation she had copied by candlelight from books hidden beneath the roof of her home. The problem revealed itself all at once. Not a minor error. Not a technicality. A disaster. If the language was exactly as described, the amendment did not protect inheritance rights. It endangered them. Worse, it created a pathway through which an entire estate could potentially pass outside the bloodline the trust was intended to protect. Her heart began beating faster. Surely she had misunderstood. She listened again. The solicitor repeated key sections. No. She had understood perfectly. Charlotte tightened her grip on the book resting in her lap. A familiar internal battle began. Stay silent. That was the safest choice. That was always the safest choice. The lawyers were experienced men. Nathaniel Ashcroft possessed one of the sharpest minds in England. If there was a problem, someone else would discover it. Someone else would speak. Yet minutes passed. No one did. The discussion continued. Assumptions built upon assumptions. The mistake remained invisible. Charlotte looked toward the document. Then toward the Duke. Nathaniel remained thoughtful. Focused. He clearly sensed uncertainty but had not yet identified its source. The realization unsettled her more than she expected. If even he had not noticed the flaw, the consequences could be severe. Lady Margaret spoke suddenly. Surely these matters are best left to professionals. The remark seemed harmless. Charlotte felt a strange chill. Her mother had not been part of the discussion. Why interrupt now? Nathaniel glanced up. Generally speaking, yes. Exactly. Lady Margaret smiled. Legal matters can be confusing. Charlotte looked at her mother. For one brief moment, their eyes met. Something passed between them. Warning. Expectation. Control. Stay quiet. The message could not have been clearer. Charlotte lowered her gaze. The room continued discussing the amendment. Another minute passed. Then another. Finally she could bear it no longer. Her conscience refused. If she remained silent and the trust collapsed years later because no one had recognized the flaw, she would never forgive herself. Slowly, she set aside her book. No one noticed. Not immediately. Charlotte drew a breath. Excuse me. The room fell silent. Every head turned. Lady Margaret's expression froze. Edward looked startled. The solicitors appeared mildly confused. Nathaniel regarded her with quiet curiosity. Charlotte's heart pounded. She almost abandoned the idea. Almost. Then she remembered the countless nights spent studying while others slept. The years of pretending ignorance. The endless dismissal. Knowledge existed for a reason. I apologize for interrupting, she said carefully. But I believe there may be a problem with the amendment. Silence deepened. One solicitor blinked. Another frowned. Lady Margaret laughed softly. Too quickly. Charlotte dear, I am certain you mean well. Mother. The word emerged more firmly than intended. The room grew still again. Nathaniel did not speak. He simply watched. Charlotte continued. The language concerning administrative authority appears broader than intended. The elderly solicitor frowned. Broader in what sense? Charlotte swallowed. Every instinct urged retreat. Yet the opening had been created. There was no turning back. If authority transfers exactly as described, the committee could potentially alter beneficiary status through procedural interpretation without directly violating the trust. Confusion crossed several faces. Then skepticism. The solicitor shook his head. That is not possible. Charlotte felt heat rise to her cheeks. I believe it is. On what basis? She hesitated. For a terrible moment she feared her voice might fail. Then years of study carried her forward. The Wetherby precedent of 1847. The room became very quiet. One solicitor straightened. Another looked genuinely surprised. Charlotte continued before courage deserted her. The court determined that administrative authority could indirectly affect beneficiary outcomes when trust language lacked explicit restrictions. Similar wording appears here. No one laughed. No one interrupted. Nathaniel's attention sharpened noticeably. Show me. Charlotte stared. Your Grace? He extended the document toward her. Show me the section. A strange hush settled over the room. Lady Margaret looked horrified. Olivia, who had entered unnoticed several minutes earlier, appeared equally stunned. Charlotte rose slowly. Every eye followed her as she crossed the room. She accepted the pages with careful hands. Her pulse thundered in her ears. For years she had hidden in plain sight. For years people had spoken around her rather than to her. Now she stood beside the most powerful man in the room holding a legal document that several trained professionals had already approved. Charlotte located the clause immediately. Here. Nathaniel leaned closer. Not close enough to breach propriety. Close enough to read. Explain. Charlotte pointed to a specific line. The amendment grants discretionary administrative review authority without defining limits. The solicitor opened his mouth. She continued before he could interrupt. If circumstances change, future committees could reinterpret eligibility standards. The original inheritance protections become vulnerable. Nathaniel studied the language. His expression changed. Slightly. Yet unmistakably. He saw it. The realization traveled across the room like a silent shockwave. One solicitor reached for the document. Another adjusted his spectacles and reread the clause. 30 seconds passed. Then 60. Finally the elderly lawyer exhaled slowly. Good heavens. No one spoke. Nathaniel lifted his gaze from the page and looked directly at Charlotte. For the first time since they had met, surprise appeared openly in his eyes. Not polite interest. Not curiosity. Genuine surprise. And beneath it, something even more dangerous. Respect. Charlotte felt every person in the room staring at her. She wished desperately to disappear. Yet she knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be quite the same again. No one moved. No one reached for a teacup. No one attempted to rescue the conversation. The drawing room, which only moments earlier had been filled with confident discussion, now felt suspended in a strange and delicate silence. Charlotte stood beside the Duke holding the document while a room full of experienced men reconsidered assumptions they had accepted without question. The elderly solicitor was the first to recover. He adjusted his spectacles and carefully reread the disputed clause. Then he read it again. Good Lord, he murmured. She is correct. The words landed with surprising force. Charlotte wished they had not. Every eye remained fixed upon her. She would have preferred a polite dismissal. A brief acknowledgement. Anything that allowed the room to move on. Instead, the confirmation only deepened everyone's attention. Nathaniel Ashcroft accepted the document from her and examined the section once more. His expression remained controlled, but Charlotte could see the calculation behind his eyes. He was tracing implications. Testing conclusions. Searching for weaknesses in her reasoning. She respected him for it. You referenced the Weatherby precedent, he said. Yes, Your Grace. Most people outside legal circles have never heard of it. Charlotte felt her pulse quicken. It is not particularly famous. A faint spark of amusement touched his features. That was not an answer. Several gentlemen exchanged glances. Charlotte suddenly became aware that she was standing in the middle of a conversation she should never have been permitted to enter. A young unmarried woman was not expected to discuss trust law before solicitors and aristocrats. Certainly not with a duke. Yet Nathaniel appeared entirely unconcerned by convention. He wanted information. Nothing else mattered. I encountered the case while reading estate litigation records, Charlotte answered carefully. Several years ago. One of the solicitors looked astonished. You studied legal records. Charlotte hesitated. Across the room, Lady Margaret's expression had become dangerously still. Only out of personal interest, Charlotte replied. The solicitor stared at her. Miss Whitmore, I have practiced law for 30 years and forgotten half the cases I once studied. Yet you recalled a precedent from nearly 2 decades ago. Charlotte wished the carpet would open beneath her feet. Instead, she offered the only answer available. It seemed important. The elderly solicitor laughed softly. Apparently it was. Nathaniel closed the document. Gentlemen, let us proceed under the assumption that the amendment requires revision. No one objected. The authority in his voice settled the matter instantly. The discussion resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. Every few minutes someone glanced toward Charlotte. At first she attempted to retreat quietly to her seat. Nathaniel stopped her without intending to. Miss Whitmore. She paused. Yes, Your Grace. If you have identified one issue, I would appreciate knowing whether you see any others. The room fell silent again. Charlotte stared. Surely he could not be serious. One solicitor appeared mildly offended. Another looked intrigued. Edward Whitmore looked as though he could not decide whether to be proud or alarmed. Lady Margaret looked neither. She looked trapped. I would not wish to intrude, Charlotte said carefully. You would not be intruding. Nathaniel's tone remained calm. You would be assisting. The distinction mattered. More than he realized. Charlotte slowly returned to the table. The next hour unfolded unlike anything she had ever experienced. Maps spread across polished wood. Documents changed hands. Questions arose. Occasionally someone asked for Charlotte's opinion. At first she answered cautiously. Then more confidently. Not because she sought attention, but because the work itself fascinated her. She pointed out inconsistencies between property descriptions drafted years apart. She identified ambiguous language within trust amendments. She suggested reviewing several overlooked records before finalizing conclusions. Each observation generated further discussion. Not every suggestion proved correct. Nathaniel challenged her more than once. So did the solicitors. Yet she welcomed disagreement. Facts mattered more than pride. Gradually skepticism faded. Respect replaced it. By late afternoon, even the most doubtful solicitor had begun consulting her directly. Miss Whitmore, would you examine this section? Miss Whitmore, what do you make of this date discrepancy? Miss Whitmore, does this resemble the Ashbury settlement? Charlotte answered as best she could. The strange experience felt almost unreal. She had spent years hiding knowledge no one wished to acknowledge. Now those same skills occupied the center of the room. The greatest surprise, however, came from Nathaniel himself. He listened. Not politely. Not indulgently. He listened as he would to any capable advisor. When he disagreed, he explained why. When she raised a valid point, he considered it seriously. There was no condescension. No amusement. No effort to make her feel unusual for understanding complex material. The absence of dismissal felt more remarkable than praise. Eventually the meeting concluded. Papers were gathered. Maps rolled away. Servants entered carrying fresh tea. The solicitors prepared to depart. Before leaving, the elderly lawyer approached Charlotte. Miss Whitmore. So, you have embarrassed several professionals today. Charlotte nearly choked on her tea. The gentleman smiled kindly. Fortunately, it was deserved. A few moments later, the visitors departed. Carriages rolled away. Doors closed. Silence returned to Whitmore House. The moment the final guest disappeared, tension rushed into the room like a storm entering through an open window. Lady Margaret set down her teacup with deliberate care. Charlotte. The single word carried unmistakable warning. Charlotte met her gaze. Yes, mother. A word. Edward shifted uneasily. Olivia suddenly found something fascinating about the flowers near the window. Charlotte followed her mother into a smaller sitting room. The door closed behind them. Lady Margaret remained standing. What possessed you? Charlotte blinked. I beg your pardon. Do not pretend confusion. Her mother's composure remained intact, but irritation sharpened every syllable. You inserted yourself into a legal discussion involving solicitors and one of the most influential men in England. Charlotte drew a slow breath. There was an error. That was not your concern. The response arrived immediately. Charlotte stared. For a moment she wondered whether she had heard correctly. An estate could have been endangered. Professionals would have handled it. Eventually. That is beside the point. Lady Margaret folded her hands. You drew attention to yourself. There it was. The real offense. Not the interruption. Not the disagreement. Attention. Charlotte looked away. A familiar sadness settled over her. You have spent years encouraging people to believe I am incapable, she said quietly. Lady Margaret's expression hardened. Do not be dramatic. Is it dramatic? Charlotte asked. You told His Grace I struggled to read. A harmless remark. It was not true. Silence followed. Lady Margaret looked genuinely irritated now. Why does this matter? Charlotte almost laughed. The question felt astonishing. Why did truth matter? Why did dignity matter? Why did being seen matter? Yet she knew better than to pursue the argument. Nothing would change. It never did. Lady Margaret stepped closer. Listen carefully. The Duke is an important man. Families compete for his notice. Olivia has every opportunity to make a favourable impression. I will not have unnecessary complications. The meaning struck Charlotte immediately. She looked at her mother. You believe I am a complication. I believe society functions according to expectations. Lady Margaret's voice softened. Charlotte, there is nothing wrong with being practical. Practical. The word sounded suspiciously like invisible. Charlotte lowered her eyes. Of course, mother. Lady Margaret relaxed slightly. She mistook surrender for agreement. She always had. The conversation ended soon afterward. Charlotte escaped to the garden, needing distance more than fresh air. Evening sunlight stretched across the lawns. Spring flowers nodded gently in the breeze. For several minutes she walked alone among quiet paths and carefully trimmed hedges. The events of the afternoon replayed endlessly in her mind. She should have felt triumphant. Instead she felt unsettled. Recognition was unfamiliar territory. So was disappointment. Because now that she had experienced what it felt like to be heard, returning to silence seemed far more difficult than before. Footsteps sounded behind her. Charlotte turned. To her surprise, Edward Whitmore approached. Her father rarely sought private conversations. Charlotte. Father. He stopped beside her. For several moments he said nothing. Then he cleared his throat. You were impressive today. Charlotte blinked. Genuine surprise swept through her. Compliments from her father were rare. Thank you. Edward looked toward the fading sunlight. I did not realize. He paused. I suppose there are many things I did not realize. The honesty in his voice hurt more than criticism ever could. Charlotte smiled gently. That is all right. No. He shook his head. I am not certain it is. Before she could respond, another servant appeared carrying a message. A note has arrived, sir. Edward accepted it. His expression changed as he read. Concern returned immediately. The familiar worry Charlotte had noticed for weeks resurfaced. Father. He folded the letter too quickly. Nothing important. Charlotte recognized the lie. So did he. Their eyes met briefly. Then Edward forced a smile and walked back toward the house. Charlotte remained where she was. The garden suddenly felt colder. Whatever difficulties haunted her father had not disappeared. If anything, they seemed worse. She watched him disappear through the terrace doors. Moments later another carriage rolled past the gates at the far end of the property. A black carriage bearing the crest of Ravenshire. Charlotte frowned. The Duke had already departed hours ago. Why send a messenger now? Curiosity stirred. An uneasy feeling accompanied it. Somewhere among trust documents, hidden letters, and growing financial concerns, larger problems were beginning to emerge. And for the first time, Charlotte found herself standing directly in their path. The following morning, Charlotte awoke with the uneasy feeling that something had shifted beneath the surface of her life. Nothing visible had changed. The house remained the same. The servants followed familiar routines. Her mother continued directing the household with effortless authority. Yet the memory of the previous afternoon lingered in every corner of her mind. For years she had hidden her knowledge because no one wished to see it. Now someone had. And that someone happened to be one of the most influential men in England. She spent the early hours attempting to focus on ordinary tasks. Correspondence. Household accounts. A review of inventory records requested by the housekeeper. Normally such work helped settle her thoughts. Today it did not. Every few minutes she found herself recalling the look on Nathaniel Ashcroft's face when he realized she had been correct. It had not been admiration. At least not initially. It had been surprise. Genuine surprise. Followed by careful reassessment. Charlotte suspected the second reaction mattered far more than the first. Shortly before noon, she was organizing account books in the morning room when a servant appeared at the door. Miss Charlotte. Yes? A message has arrived from Ravenshire House. Charlotte looked up sharply. For father? No, miss. For you. Her pulse stumbled. For me? The footman stepped forward and presented a sealed envelope. The Ravenshire crest stood prominently upon the wax seal. Charlotte stared at it for several seconds before accepting it. Messages from dukes did not arrive for women like her? Certainly not for women her mother insisted were incapable of understanding serious matters. The servant withdrew. Charlotte remained seated, staring at the envelope. Finally she broke the seal. The note inside was brief. Miss Whitmore, I would appreciate your assistance regarding several trust documents discussed during our recent meeting. If convenient, I invite you to review the materials tomorrow afternoon at Ravenshire House. Your observations may prove valuable. Respectfully, Nathaniel Ashcroft, Duke of Ravenshire. Charlotte read the message twice. Then a third time. She was still holding it when the door opened. Lady Margaret entered. The moment she noticed the letter, her eyes sharpened. What is that? Charlotte folded the note. A message. From whom? There was no point avoiding the answer. The Duke. Silence followed. Brief. Dangerous. Lady Margaret extended her hand. Let me see it. Charlotte hesitated. Then passed over the note. Her mother read it. The color slowly drained from her face. This is inappropriate. Charlotte blinked. How? A private invitation. To review trust documents. That is not the point. Lady Margaret folded the letter with precise movements. Why would His Grace seek your assistance? Charlotte knew better than to answer honestly. Because he values competence more than appearances. Because he listened. Because he noticed what others ignored. Instead she said, you would have to ask him. Lady Margaret's jaw tightened. I intend to. That evening, tension spread through the household like smoke. Olivia appeared unusually quiet during dinner. Edward Whitmore seemed distracted. Lady Margaret remained composed, yet Charlotte recognized the signs of irritation hidden beneath her elegance. Several times she caught her mother studying her with a mixture of confusion and concern. As though Charlotte had suddenly become someone unfamiliar. After dinner, Edward requested a private conversation with his wife. Their voices drifted faintly from the study. Charlotte could not distinguish words. She did not need to. The disagreement was obvious. Later that night, she climbed the narrow staircase to her hidden library beneath the roof. Books surrounded her. Familiar. Reliable. Honest. She settled at the small desk and opened a legal volume. Yet concentration proved impossible. Her thoughts returned repeatedly to the invitation. Why had Nathaniel asked for her specifically? He possessed access to the finest solicitors in England. Entire firms existed to handle matters like these. He did not need assistance from an overlooked gentleman's daughter hidden in a Mayfair drawing room. Unless he genuinely valued her perspective. The possibility felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The next afternoon arrived bright and unusually warm. A carriage from Ravenshire House arrived precisely at 2 o'clock. Charlotte descended the staircase prepared for departure. Her gown was simple but elegant. Dark blue silk. Minimal jewelry. Nothing that might attract attention. Lady Margaret waited near the entrance hall. Remember yourself. Charlotte paused. Mother. You are there to observe. Nothing more. Charlotte looked at her calmly. I was invited to assist. Do not mistake courtesy for significance. The words stung more than they should have. Yet before Charlotte could respond, the front doors opened. The waiting carriage stood beyond. She inclined her head politely. Good afternoon, Mother. Then she departed. The journey to Ravenshire House lasted less than 20 minutes. Charlotte spent most of it watching London pass beyond the carriage windows. Shops bustled. Gentlemen hurried along sidewalks. Delivery wagons crowded the streets. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet she felt as though she were travelling toward something unknown. Ravenshire House stood among the grandest residences in Mayfair. Elegant stonework. Immaculate gardens. Tall windows reflecting afternoon sunlight. Everything conveyed quiet power rather than extravagant display. A butler greeted her at the entrance and escorted her through a series of beautifully appointed rooms. Finally, they reached a library unlike any Charlotte had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling shelves stretched across 2 stories. Richwood paneling gleamed in the afternoon light. Hundreds upon hundreds of volumes filled the room. Charlotte stopped walking. For a moment she simply stared. Most people react the same way. Nathaniel's voice came from across the room. Charlotte turned. He stood beside a large table covered in documents. Amusement flickered in his eyes. I apologize, she said. Do not. He glanced around the library. I have been doing exactly the same thing since childhood. Charlotte smiled despite herself. Then perhaps there is hope for me. There is certainly hope for anyone who appreciates books. He gestured toward the table. Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. Nathaniel motioned toward several chairs. Please sit. Charlotte obeyed. Documents lay arranged in careful stacks. Maps occupied one corner. Several ledgers occupied another. Everything suggested hours of meticulous preparation. You have been busy, she observed. Unfortunately. Nathaniel settled across from her. The trust issue proved more complicated than expected. Charlotte glanced toward the papers. Did the amendment require revision? Substantial revision. His expression turned thoughtful. Several solicitors remain annoyed by that fact. Charlotte looked down quickly. I did not intend to embarrass anyone. Yet you succeeded magnificently. The remark carried enough humor to make her laugh. Nathaniel smiled briefly. Then his expression grew serious. Miss Whitmore. Yes? May I ask you a question? Of course. He folded his hands. Where did you learn all of this? Charlotte froze. There it was. The question she had been expecting since the moment she spoke in the drawing room. For several seconds she searched for a safe answer. None existed. Nathaniel waited patiently. Books, she finally said. One eyebrow lifted. Books. Many books. I gathered that much. His tone remained gentle. Most people do not acquire specialized knowledge of trust law through casual reading. Charlotte looked toward the library shelves. Perhaps not. Then how? She hesitated. Old habits urged caution. Yet something about Nathaniel made dishonesty difficult. My grandfather maintained a substantial collection. Legal texts. Among other things. Nathaniel nodded for her to continue. Charlotte drew a slow breath. When I was 13, I discovered several volumes discussing estate disputes. I found them interesting. At 13, I was an unusual child. Clearly. Amusement returned to his eyes. Charlotte found herself smiling. One book led to another. Then another. Eventually I began copying sections into notebooks. Nathaniel studied her carefully. For 11 years. Approximately. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. Finally Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. And your family knows. Charlotte looked away. That alone answered the question. Understanding appeared immediately. They do not. They know I enjoy reading. That is not what I asked. Charlotte remained quiet. Nathaniel considered her for several moments. Why would anyone conceal such ability? The question sounded genuine. Not accusatory. Genuine confusion. Charlotte wished she could answer it. She wished she understood it herself. Perhaps some talents are less welcome than others. Nathaniel frowned slightly. That seems an extraordinary waste. The simple statement struck her more deeply than he intended. Extraordinary waste. No one had ever described her situation that way before. Most people accepted it without question. Nathaniel did not. The realization lingered between them. Then a knock sounded at the library door. A servant entered carrying additional records. Nathaniel accepted them and glanced through the contents. His expression darkened slightly. Interesting. What is it? Charlotte asked. He handed her a document. Another inconsistency. She examined the page. Her eyes widened. The figures did not align with previous records. Not even remotely. Charlotte looked up. Nathaniel was already watching her. You see it too. It was not a question. It was certainty. And for the first time in her life, Charlotte realized someone expected her intelligence rather than doubted it. The feeling was far more dangerous than admiration. Because once a person experienced being truly seen, it became impossible to return comfortably to the shadows. Charlotte stared at the figures for several seconds before speaking. The discrepancy was impossible to ignore. Two separate records described the same parcel of land. Yet the reported income differed by an amount large enough to alter the trust's financial obligation significantly. This cannot be an ordinary accounting error, she said quietly. Nathaniel nodded. That was my conclusion as well. Charlotte reviewed the page again. The handwriting matched. The dates aligned. The signatures appeared legitimate. Yet the numbers themselves told conflicting stories. How many documents contain inconsistencies like this? She asked. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. More than I would prefer. How many? 7 so far. Charlotte looked up sharply. 7 was not a coincidence. 7 suggested a pattern. Nathaniel watched her expression carefully. You see why I asked for your assistance. Someone reviewing these records casually might overlook them. Precisely. Charlotte lowered her gaze to the papers. The room seemed unusually quiet. Sunlight filtered through tall windows. Dust drifted lazily through golden beams. Somewhere beyond the library walls, servants moved through the vast house. Yet inside the room, everything narrowed to documents, questions, and possibilities. When did you first suspect something was wrong? She asked. Nathaniel considered the question. Several months ago. Charlotte looked surprised. Months. The inconsistencies appeared insignificant individually. A delayed payment. An unusual notation. A valuation that seemed slightly inflated. He folded his hands. Unfortunately, small irregularities have a habit of becoming larger ones. Charlotte smiled faintly. That sounds like experience speaking. Experience usually speaks after causing inconvenience. She laughed softly. The sound seemed to please him. For a moment, neither returned to the documents. The conversation drifted elsewhere. They discussed historical cases, property law, parliamentary reforms, the evolution of trust structures across England. Charlotte forgot herself completely. She forgot caution. She forgot her mother's warnings. Most of all, she forgot the habit of measuring every word before speaking. Nathaniel never treated her knowledge as unusual. He treated it as useful. The distinction changed everything. Hours passed with surprising speed. Eventually a servant arrived carrying a tray of tea and light refreshments. Nathaniel thanked him and moved several documents aside to make space. We should probably eat before one of us forgets entirely. Charlotte glanced toward the clock and blinked. It was already late afternoon. Good heavens. Exactly my reaction. He poured tea for both of them. The simple gesture felt oddly intimate despite its complete propriety. Not because of the action itself. Because no one had ever shared intellectual companionship with her before. Most conversations in her life revolved around weather, etiquette, marriages, or social obligations. This was different. Nathaniel handed her a cup. May I ask another question? Charlotte smiled cautiously. That depends on the question. Fair enough. He settled into his chair. Where did you find access to legal records detailed enough to learn trust law at this level? Charlotte hesitated. Then she realized the truth was not particularly scandalous. Merely unconventional. Several years ago, I discovered a retired barrister donated portions of his library to a reading society near Bloomsbury. Nathaniel's eyebrows lifted. You traveled there alone? Not entirely alone. A maid accompanied me. Repeatedly. Every week for nearly 3 years. Genuine surprise crossed his face. 3 years? Charlotte nodded. The caretaker eventually allowed me access to additional materials stored in the archives. Nathaniel stared at her. Then he began laughing. Not loudly. Not mockingly. Pure amusement. Charlotte blinked. What? Nothing. He shook his head. I was simply imagining the expressions of every solicitor in London if they knew they had been unknowingly challenged by a young woman studying in a reading archive. Charlotte could not help laughing as well. I doubt they would approve. I suspect they would be horrified. The shared amusement lingered longer than either expected. Eventually the conversation resumed. Yet something subtle had changed. The distance between Duke and gentleman's daughter remained. Social hierarchy did not disappear. Neither forgot it. Yet a foundation of mutual respect now existed beneath every exchange. As afternoon faded toward evening, they returned to the records. Charlotte examined ledgers while Nathaniel compared trust amendments against older estate documents. More inconsistencies emerged. Some involved valuations. Others involved procedural approvals. None proved conclusive alone. Together, however, they formed an increasingly troubling picture. Near sunset, Charlotte closed a ledger and frowned. Your Grace. Nathaniel looked up immediately. What is it? She turned the book toward him. This signature. He studied the page. Yes? It appears 3 times across separate records. That is not unusual. No. Charlotte tapped the page gently. But the handwriting changes. Nathaniel leaned forward. Silence settled between them. He examined each example carefully. Then another. Then a third. His expression darkened. You are correct. Charlotte felt a chill. The signatures are similar. Not identical. One hand imitates another. Nathaniel's voice remained calm, though she sensed tension beneath the surface. He reached for additional files. Several minutes later, he found 2 more examples. The same issue appeared again. Charlotte sat back slowly. Someone altered records. Nathaniel remained silent. The conclusion hung between them. Neither wanted to voice it fully. Not yet. Because once spoken aloud, it would transform uncertainty into accusation. Finally, Nathaniel exhaled. At minimum, someone was careless. Charlotte met his gaze. And at maximum, he looked toward the growing stack of questionable documents. At maximum, someone benefited from confusion. The answer unsettled her. Yet it also explained far too much. The inconsistent figures. The amended language. The unusual valuations. None of it seemed random anymore. Outside the windows, evening shadows lengthened across the city. The library gradually darkened. Servants entered to light lamps. Warm golden light filled the room. Nathaniel closed the ledger and stood. That is enough for today. Charlotte glanced toward the piles of records. We barely examined half of them. Which means they will still be here tomorrow. He offered a faint smile. Unlike your patience, which I suspect has limits. Charlotte rose as well. That remains unproven. Everything eventually becomes proven. His eyes held hers for a brief moment. The remark carried an unexpected warmth. Charlotte looked away first. The butler appeared shortly afterward to announce that her carriage was ready. Nathaniel escorted her toward the entrance hall. The journey through Ravenshire House felt shorter than before. Perhaps because conversation continued naturally. They discussed books, history, architecture, small topics, comfortable topics. Yet beneath every exchange remained the unspoken awareness that they had accomplished something unusual together. At the entrance, the evening air drifted through the open doors. Charlotte prepared to step into the waiting carriage. Miss Whitmore. She turned. Nathaniel stood beneath the glow of the entry lanterns. Thank you. The words were simple. Entirely sincere. Charlotte felt unexpectedly moved. For what? For helping me see what others missed. She smiled gently. You would have found it eventually. Nathaniel shook his head. Perhaps. His gaze remained steady. But not soon enough. For a moment neither spoke. Then Charlotte inclined her head. Good evening, Your Grace. Good evening, Miss Whitmore. The carriage departed moments later. Charlotte watched Ravenshire House disappear behind them as they travelled through the evening streets of London. She should have been exhausted. Instead, her thoughts raced. Something larger than accounting errors was unfolding. The documents proved it. Yet another realization troubled her even more. She had spent years believing invisibility was safety. Years convincing herself she wanted nothing else. Now, after only a handful of conversations with one observant duke, that certainty was beginning to crumble. And back at Whitmore House, another development awaited her. As the carriage approached home, she noticed unfamiliar lights burning inside her father's study. Multiple lamps. Multiple silhouettes moving behind the curtains. Visitors. Important visitors. At this hour. Charlotte's unease returned immediately. Whatever burden Edward Whitmore had been hiding was growing heavier. And increasingly, it seemed connected to secrets that were no longer willing to remain hidden. Charlotte barely stepped through the front doors before she sensed something was wrong. The atmosphere inside Whitmore House felt unusually strained. Servants moved quietly. Conversation stopped when she entered a room. Even the air seemed heavier. She removed her gloves and handed them to a maid. Who is with father? The maid hesitated. Mr. Carlyle, Miss. And Mr. Benton. Charlotte recognized both names immediately. Neither man visited socially. They were financial advisors. Her unease deepened. She climbed the staircase toward the family wing but slowed as she passed the study. Voices drifted through the closed door. Her father's voice sounded tired. Another voice sounded firm. Impatient. The extension cannot continue indefinitely. Charlotte froze. I understand. That was Edward Whitmore. Then additional guarantees will be necessary. Silence followed. Charlotte moved away before she could hear more. She did not believe in eavesdropping. Yet what little she had heard confirmed her growing suspicion. Something serious threatened the family's finances. That evening, dinner proved unusually uncomfortable. Edward spoke little. Olivia attempted several cheerful observations that fell flat. Lady Margaret maintained perfect composure, though Charlotte noticed the tension hidden beneath it. At one point Edward reached for a wine glass and accidentally knocked a spoon from the table. The small mistake startled everyone. He apologized immediately. The silence afterward felt far larger than the incident deserved. Charlotte watched her father carefully. He looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. As though he carried a burden too heavy to share. After dinner, Charlotte retreated to the library beneath the roof. She intended to read. Instead, she found herself staring at the same page for nearly 20 minutes. Her thoughts remained fixed on two questions. What trouble had her father hidden for so long? And why did her mother seem determined to keep Charlotte away from every important conversation? The answers arrived sooner than expected. 2 mornings later, Charlotte entered the breakfast room earlier than usual. She stopped immediately. A stack of account ledgers rested on the sideboard. Several pages protruded from the top volume. Most people would have walked past without noticing. Charlotte did not. Numbers had always attracted her attention. She approached carefully. The ledger lay open to a page detailing estate expenditures. At first glance, everything appeared ordinary. Then she noticed several entries crossed out and rewritten. Her pulse quickened. She glanced toward the doorway. Empty. Quiet. Charlotte reviewed the figures more closely. The corrections were recent. Large sums had been moved between accounts. Debts deferred. Payments delayed. She turned another page. Then another. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Whitmore finances were in far worse condition than anyone realized. Several investments had failed. Land revenue had declined. Outstanding obligations continued increasing. The family was balancing on the edge of a financial cliff. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Charlotte quickly stepped away. Moments later, Edward entered. The instant he saw the open ledger, his face changed. Charlotte. She met his gaze. Father. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Edward sighed. How much did you see? Charlotte answered honestly. Enough. He closed his eyes briefly. The gesture carried enormous weariness. I hope to spare you this. From what? She asked softly. Reality. He managed a humorless smile. Perhaps. Charlotte moved closer. Father, how serious is it? Edward stared at the ledger. Then toward the window. Finally back at her. Something in his expression shifted. Perhaps exhaustion. Perhaps resignation. Perhaps the realization that she already understood more than anyone expected. Very serious. The words fell heavily between them. Charlotte remained silent. Edward continued. Several years ago I invested in a shipping venture. The projections appeared promising. Charlotte already knew what came next. It failed. Spectacularly. He rubbed a hand across his face. I attempted to recover the losses. Then another investment performed poorly. Then another. Charlotte felt her heart tighten. Mother knows. Of course. Edward laughed softly. The sound carried no amusement. Your mother has spent years protecting our reputation while I attempted to repair the damage. Suddenly many mysteries began making sense. The hidden meetings. The financial advisors. The letters. The tension. Even Lady Margaret's obsession with appearances. Not vanity. Survival. How bad is it? Charlotte asked again. Edward hesitated. Without significant improvement, portions of the estate may eventually need to be sold. Charlotte felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. The Whitmore estate had belonged to the family for generations. Selling land was not merely a financial matter. It represented decline. Public decline. In their world, society noticed such things immediately. Edward looked ashamed. I failed all of you. No. Charlotte shook her head. You made mistakes. The distinction feels insignificant. It is not. He studied her quietly. You sound very certain. Charlotte almost smiled. Years spent analyzing legal disputes had taught her one truth. Human beings made mistakes constantly. The important question was what happened afterward. Before she could respond, the breakfast room door opened. Lady Margaret entered. She stopped abruptly upon seeing them together. Her gaze moved from Edward to Charlotte and finally to the ledger. Understanding appeared instantly. Edward. The single word carried warning. Edward straightened. She knows. Lady Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Wonderful. Charlotte frowned. Mother. Do not. Lady Margaret approached the table. Do not tell me everything is fine. Do not tell me this changes nothing. We have spent years preventing disaster. Edward looked away. Charlotte suddenly realized something important. Her mother was afraid. Not angry. Afraid. Fear explained far more than irritation ever had. Why keep it from me? Charlotte asked quietly. Lady Margaret laughed once. The sound held no joy. Because someone had to be protected. Protected from what? The truth. Charlotte stared. I am not a child. No. Lady Margaret's eyes met hers. You are not. For the first time, something vulnerable flickered beneath her mother's controlled exterior. It vanished quickly. Yet Charlotte saw it. Lady Margaret turned away. There is no purpose discussing this further. Then she left the room. Silence followed. Edward exhaled heavily. Your mother has carried more than you realize. Charlotte believed him. Yet another question now troubled her. If the family had struggled financially for years, how had they remained afloat? The numbers did not entirely add up. Several gaps remained. That afternoon Charlotte received another invitation from Ravenshire House. This time she accepted immediately. When she arrived, Nathaniel noticed her distraction almost at once. Something is wrong. Charlotte looked up from the documents. What makes you think that? You have reviewed the same page 4 times. She blinked. Have I? 5 now. Despite herself, Charlotte laughed. Nathaniel set aside his pen. What happened? She hesitated. Yet increasingly she found herself trusting him. Not because he was powerful. Because he listened. There was a difference. I learned something about my family. Nathaniel waited. Financial difficulties. Understanding crossed his face. More extensive than you expected. Charlotte nodded. Much more. Nathaniel remained thoughtful for a moment. Then he asked a question she did not expect. Has your family always relied upon your sister's social prospects? Charlotte looked at him sharply. What? Answer the question. Charlotte considered. Olivia has always received considerable attention. Nathaniel leaned back slowly. And you? A strange sadness touched her. I was useful in other ways. Nathaniel's expression darkened slightly. He said nothing further. Yet Charlotte sensed he was connecting pieces she had never intended anyone to see. The afternoon passed quickly. They continued reviewing records. More inconsistencies emerged. More questions followed. Yet shortly before she departed, an unexpected visitor arrived. Lord Henry Beckett. A longtime friend of Nathaniel's and owner of several neighbouring estates. Charlotte had met him only briefly before. He entered the library carrying a bundle of correspondence. Ravenshire, I found the valuations you requested. Then he noticed Charlotte. Miss Whitmore. Lord Beckett. Henry set the papers down. I hope you are helping him. Otherwise he has become impossible these past weeks. Nathaniel sighed. I am sitting right here. Exactly. Henry smiled toward Charlotte. He spends all day buried beneath records. Charlotte laughed. I have noticed. Henry's amusement faded slightly as he glanced between them. Then he looked at Nathaniel. By the way, I confirmed something interesting. Nathaniel immediately became alert. What? Henry tapped one of the documents. Several financial recommendations submitted to your trust originated from the same advisor. Charlotte watched the exchange carefully. Nathaniel frowned. Which advisor? Henry named a man Charlotte had never heard before. Then he added another detail. The same advisor consulted for several struggling families in recent years. Silence followed. Nathaniel's gaze sharpened. Struggling families. Families facing debt. Henry nodded. Whitmore among them. Charlotte froze. Both men looked toward her. The room suddenly felt very still. Henry appeared genuinely surprised. You did not know. Charlotte shook her head slowly. Nathaniel's expression became unreadable. Another piece had just fallen into place. And judging by the look in his eyes, the discovery concerned him far more than it should have. Because what had begun as questionable trust documents was becoming something much larger. And for the first time, Charlotte realized her own family might somehow be connected to the mystery they were trying to solve. Charlotte did not speak during the carriage ride home. The revelation from Lord Beckett echoed endlessly through her thoughts. Whitmore among them. The word seemed harmless on the surface. Yet the implications were enormous. If the same financial advisor had influenced both Ravenshire trust matters and the decisions that nearly ruined her family's finances, then the two problems might not be separate at all. By the time she arrived at Whitmore House, evening shadows had settled across Mayfair. Lamps glowed behind tall windows. Carriages rolled along damp streets. London continued its endless movement, unaware that Charlotte's understanding of her own life had shifted yet again. She entered quietly, hoping to avoid conversation. Fate had other plans. Charlotte. Olivia's voice carried from the drawing room. Charlotte paused. Her sister sat near the fire arranging flowers. You are home later than usual. The review took longer than expected. Olivia smiled. You spend a remarkable amount of time with the Duke these days. The remark sounded casual. It was not. Charlotte recognized the careful tone immediately. We are reviewing legal records. Of course. Olivia adjusted a rose stem. Everyone says so. Charlotte frowned slightly. Everyone. Olivia laughed softly. London notices things, Charlotte. Unease stirred. There is nothing to notice. If you say so. The conversation ended there, but the discomfort remained. Later that night, Charlotte sat awake in her hidden library long after midnight. Books surrounded her. Candlelight flickered across familiar shelves. Yet concentration proved impossible. She kept returning to one question. Why would an advisor connected to struggling families also appear within Ravenshire trust matters? The coincidence felt too precise. Too convenient. Eventually exhaustion forced her to sleep. The following afternoon brought an unexpected invitation. A formal note arrived from Nathaniel. Miss Whitmore, Lady Eleanor Hartwell requests assistance regarding a complicated inheritance matter affecting her late husband's estate. I believe your perspective may prove valuable. If you are willing, I would appreciate your presence tomorrow afternoon. Nathaniel Ashcroft. Charlotte read the note twice. Then a third time. This invitation differed from the previous ones. It involved another family entirely. Another estate. Another legal dispute. More importantly, it meant Nathaniel intended to involve her publicly, at least to a limited degree. The realization was both exciting and alarming. Lady Margaret's reaction proved exactly what Charlotte expected. Absolutely not. Charlotte folded the letter calmly. Mother. No. Lady Margaret rose from her chair. This has gone far enough. Charlotte struggled to remain patient. Lady Hartwell requires assistance. Lady Hartwell requires solicitors. She has solicitors. Then she does not require you. Charlotte looked at her mother carefully. Why does this upset you so much? The question struck harder than intended. For a brief moment, uncertainty crossed Lady Margaret's face. Then irritation returned. Because society has expectations. Society seems remarkably convenient whenever it agrees with you. Silence followed. Dangerous silence. Charlotte immediately regretted the remark. Not because it was false. Because it revealed more frustration than she intended. Lady Margaret stared at her. You have changed. Charlotte's heart tightened. No. Her voice softened. I have not changed. The truth settled heavily between them. She had not changed. She had simply stopped pretending to be smaller than she was. The following day arrived bright and clear. Nathaniel's carriage collected her shortly after noon. This time the destination was not Ravenshire House. Instead they travelled toward a smaller estate on the outskirts of London. Lady Eleanor Hartwell greeted them personally. At 38, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Yet exhaustion shadowed her features. Your Grace. She curtsied. Then turned toward Charlotte. Miss Whitmore. Thank you for coming. Charlotte smiled gently. I am happy to assist if I can. Lady Eleanor led them into a private sitting room. Documents covered nearly every available surface. Letters. Estate records. Probate filings. Financial reports. The signs of a long and frustrating dispute were impossible to miss. My husband died 2 years ago, Lady Eleanor explained. The estate should have passed directly to our son. Nathaniel nodded. Yet complications arose. Complications arrived with remarkable enthusiasm. Despite her difficulties, a spark of humor remained. Charlotte liked her immediately. The afternoon unfolded quickly. Lady Eleanor explained how several administrators questioned her son's inheritance rights due to conflicting interpretations of older family documents. Multiple solicitors had reviewed the case. Progress remained painfully slow. Charlotte listened carefully. Occasionally she asked questions. Occasionally she reviewed records. Gradually a pattern emerged. Not fraud. Not deception. Something simpler. Several key assumptions rested upon a mistaken interpretation of a decades-old amendment. Charlotte requested additional documents. Lady Eleanor provided them. An hour later, Charlotte found the answer. She stared at the page for several moments before speaking. Lady Hartwell. The widow looked up immediately. Yes? Charlotte turned the document toward her. I believe your son was never at risk. Confusion crossed the room. Nathaniel leaned forward. Explain. Charlotte pointed to a specific clause. Everyone focused on the amendment. She moved her finger lower. But the amendment references an earlier settlement that remained legally binding. Silence followed. Lady Eleanor blinked. Nathaniel examined the page. Then another. Then another. His expression changed. Good heavens. Charlotte felt a small surge of confidence. The original settlement already established inheritance priority. Nathaniel looked toward Lady Eleanor. She is correct. For several seconds the widow simply stared. Then tears filled her eyes. Not dramatic tears. Quiet tears of relief. Are you certain? Nathaniel nodded. Very. Lady Eleanor pressed a hand against her mouth. 2 years. Her voice trembled. 2 years of uncertainty. Charlotte suddenly understood the weight this woman had been carrying. Fear. Worry. Endless waiting. All because no one had followed the chain of documents far enough. Lady Eleanor looked directly at Charlotte. You found this? Charlotte nodded modestly. The records were very clear once arranged correctly. The widow laughed softly through tears. Miss Whitmore, I could kiss every book in England. The room relaxed. Even Nathaniel smiled openly. Yet the most surprising moment came later. As they prepared to leave, Lady Eleanor insisted upon inviting several neighbouring families for tea the following week. And Miss Whitmore must attend. Charlotte blinked. That is unnecessary. It is entirely necessary. Lady Eleanor's eyes sparkled. I intend to introduce the woman who solved a problem that defeated half my advisors. Charlotte felt immediate alarm. Please do not. Nathaniel looked suspiciously amused. I suspect that request will fail. Your Grace is correct. Lady Eleanor smiled. Spectacularly. Several days later, Charlotte arrived at Hartwell Manor expecting a modest gathering. She was wrong. The drawing room contained nearly 24 guests. Landowners. Widows. Gentlemen. Several members of the local gentry. Conversation filled the room. Charlotte immediately wished to disappear. You look alarmed. Nathaniel appeared beside her. I am alarmed. Understandable. You knew. I suspected. Charlotte gave him a look. Nathaniel almost laughed. Before she could respond, Lady Eleanor crossed the room and raised her voice slightly. Ladies and gentlemen. Conversation gradually quieted. Charlotte felt dread settle in her stomach. I would like to acknowledge someone whose assistance recently protected my son's inheritance. Every head turned. Lady Eleanor smiled directly at Charlotte. Miss Charlotte Whitmore. The room fell silent. Charlotte's pulse thundered. She wanted the floor to open beneath her feet. Instead, she remained standing while Lady Eleanor continued. Several respected professionals reviewed our matter. Miss Whitmore found the answer. Murmur spread through the room. Surprise. Curiosity. Interest. Charlotte felt dozens of eyes studying her. Not with mockery. With respect. Genuine respect. The sensation felt entirely unfamiliar. Nathaniel watched quietly from across the room. Pride flickered in his expression. Not pride in himself. Pride in her. The realization startled Charlotte more than the public attention. Throughout the remainder of the gathering, guests approached with questions. Some asked about the inheritance matter. Others discussed books, history, and estates. For the first time in her life, strangers treated her intellect as something valuable rather than inconvenient. Yet not everyone appreciated the change. Near the refreshments table, Charlotte overheard two women speaking in lowered voices. Since when is Miss Whitmore an authority on legal affairs? Apparently since the Duke decided she was. The words were not openly cruel. Yet they carried enough sharpness to sting. Charlotte pretended not to hear. Unfortunately, someone else did. Nathaniel. His expression cooled instantly. He crossed the room. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Simply with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Miss Whitmore's observation solved a matter that remained unresolved for 2 years, he said calmly. Any authority she possesses appears thoroughly earned. Silence followed. The women flushed with embarrassment. Nathaniel inclined his head politely and walked away. Nothing more. No confrontation. No lecture. Yet the effect was immediate. The room had witnessed it. Charlotte had witnessed it. For the first time, someone powerful had publicly defended her competence instead of dismissing it. The moment lingered long after the conversation ended. And later that evening, as their carriage rolled back toward London beneath a sky filled with stars, Charlotte found herself staring out the window in thoughtful silence. Nathaniel eventually broke the quiet. You handled today well. Charlotte smiled faintly. I spent most of it wishing to escape. No one noticed. That seems unlikely. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. People notice something else. What? His answer came without hesitation. They noticed you were extraordinary. Charlotte immediately looked away. The compliment landed with unexpected force. Neither spoke again for several minutes. Outside, London lights gradually appeared in the distance. Inside the carriage, another realization settled quietly between them. What had begun as legal documents and estate records had become something far more dangerous. Because admiration could be ignored. Respect could not. And every day, both of them found it becoming increasingly difficult to pretend that nothing had changed. The rumors began 3 days later. Charlotte first encountered them in the most ordinary way imaginable. She entered a milliner's shop in Bond Street shortly after noon and immediately sensed something unusual. Conversation softened as she passed. 2 ladies standing near a display of ribbons glanced toward her before quickly looking away. Another woman lowered her voice the moment Charlotte approached. At first she dismissed the feeling. Then it happened again. And again. By the time she returned to Whitmore House, unease had settled firmly in her stomach. Something was wrong. The confirmation arrived that evening. Olivia entered Charlotte's bedchamber without knocking. Well? Charlotte looked up from her book. Well, what? Olivia folded her arms. You have become quite famous. Charlotte frowned. I sincerely hope not. Olivia laughed. The sound held very little humor. Unfortunately, society has other plans. Charlotte closed her book. What are you talking about? Olivia hesitated. Then she walked toward the window. People are talking about you and the Duke. The words landed harder than Charlotte expected. What people? Everyone. Olivia turned. Or at least everyone who enjoys gossip, which amounts to most of London. Charlotte stared. That is absurd. Of course it is. Olivia's smile appeared strained. That has never stopped anyone before. After Olivia left, Charlotte sat motionless for several minutes. Rumors were nothing new. Society survived on speculation. Yet this felt different. More personal. More dangerous. The following afternoon confirmed her fears. Lady Margaret summoned both daughters to the drawing room. The moment Charlotte entered, she understood. Her mother's expression was colder than she had seen in years. Sit. Charlotte obeyed. Olivia remained near the fireplace. Silence stretched. Finally Lady Margaret spoke. Lady Ashcombe called this morning. Charlotte waited. She believes the Duke intends to marry you. Charlotte nearly laughed from sheer disbelief. What? Exactly. Lady Margaret's voice sharpened. What have you been doing? Charlotte stared. Reviewing legal records. Do not be clever. I am not being clever. Her patience began to fray. I have done nothing improper. Then explain why society believes otherwise. Charlotte looked away. Because society preferred fantasy to truth. Because a woman and a man could not apparently share intellectual respect without someone inventing romance. Because gossip required no evidence. Yet none of those answers would satisfy her mother. I cannot explain other people's imaginations. Lady Margaret rose. Do you understand what this could do to Olivia? The question struck Charlotte like a slap. Not because it was cruel. Because it revealed the truth beneath everything else. Olivia. Always Olivia. Charlotte looked toward her sister. For the first time, she noticed something unexpected. Olivia appeared uncomfortable. Not triumphant. Uncomfortable. Mother. Olivia spoke quietly. Perhaps this is not Charlotte's fault. Lady Margaret turned sharply. You cannot be serious. I am merely saying rumors are rumors. Charlotte blinked. The defense surprised her almost as much as it surprised Lady Margaret. Yet the moment passed quickly. Lady Margaret dismissed them both shortly afterward. Charlotte escaped outside. Fresh air felt necessary. The garden offered temporary peace. Spring flowers bloomed beneath warm afternoon sunlight. Birds moved among carefully trimmed hedges. Yet even here she could not escape her thoughts. The rumors themselves mattered less than their consequences. Reputation shaped everything in their world. Opportunities. Friendships. Marriages. A careless whisper could alter lives. And increasingly, those whispers centered around her. 3 days later, the situation worsened. Lady Eleanor Hartwell hosted another gathering. Charlotte attended reluctantly. The moment she entered the ballroom, she sensed the shift. Conversations paused. Curious eyes followed her movements. Smiles appeared overly knowing. One elderly gentleman even winked at her. Charlotte wanted to disappear. Nathaniel arrived shortly afterward. His presence transformed the room immediately. Yet instead of easing her discomfort, it amplified it. Because every glance toward him seemed to generate two more directed toward her. By the time dinner was announced, Charlotte's nerves were exhausted. Unfortunately, society had not finished with her. During the meal, Lady Penrose leaned forward across the table. "Miss Whitmore." Charlotte forced a smile. "Lady Penrose. You must tell us." Charlotte felt immediate alarm. "Tell you what?" The woman laughed. Several nearby guests leaned closer. "How you captured the Duke's attention." Silence spread around the table. Charlotte's cheeks warmed. "I have captured nothing. Modesty is admirable." Lady Penrose smiled knowingly. "But unnecessary." Charlotte wished the floor would open beneath her. Across the table, Nathaniel's expression became dangerously calm. She recognized that look by now. It usually preceded someone realizing they had made a mistake. Lady Penrose continued. "Half the unmarried women in England have attempted the same thing." "Lady Penrose." Nathaniel's voice cut gently through the conversation. The room fell silent. "Yes, Your Grace. You appear to be under a misunderstanding." The woman blinked. Nathaniel set down his glass. "Miss Whitmore has earned my attention through intelligence, diligence, and insight." Silence deepened. Nothing else has ever been required. No one spoke. Several guests looked embarrassed. Others looked surprised. Charlotte stared at her plate because meeting anyone's eyes felt impossible. Yet beneath the embarrassment, another emotion stirred. Gratitude. Nathaniel had not merely corrected a rumor. He had publicly attached her value to her mind rather than speculation. The distinction mattered enormously. Unfortunately, not everyone appreciated it. Later that evening, Charlotte overheard two younger women speaking near the ballroom doors. "That only proves it." "Proves what?" "Men always admire women who flatter them." Charlotte stopped walking. The second woman laughed. "Perhaps she convinced him she is clever." The word stung more than they should have. Not because strangers questioned her. Because part of her feared society would never believe the truth. Intelligence in women remained acceptable only when it stayed decorative. The moment it became influential, suspicion followed. Charlotte quietly retreated to the terrace. Cool night air greeted her. Moonlight reflected across gardens below. She welcomed the solitude. "You disappeared." Nathaniel's voice came from behind her. Charlotte turned. Briefly. He joined her near the stone balustrade. Neither spoke immediately. Music drifted faintly through open ballroom doors. Laughter followed. Life continued. Yet the terrace felt strangely separate from it all. Finally Nathaniel broke the silence. "The rumors upset you." It was not a question. Charlotte looked toward the gardens. "They are unpleasant. They are inaccurate. That has never stopped anyone." A faint smile touched his face. "Unfortunately true." Charlotte exhaled slowly. "I spent years being invisible." The admission escaped before she could stop it. Nathaniel remained silent. She continued. "Now everyone suddenly notices me, and somehow that is worse." To her surprise, Nathaniel laughed softly. An understandable conclusion. Charlotte glanced at him. "You disagree?" "Entirely." She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Nathaniel looked toward the ballroom. "Because being seen for the wrong reasons is temporary." His gaze returned to her. "Being seen for the right reasons lasts." Something in his expression made her heart beat slightly faster. Not because of romance. Because of certainty. He believed what he said. Completely. The realization unsettled her. Before she could respond, footsteps interrupted them. Lord Beckett emerged onto the terrace carrying a glass of wine. There you are. He stopped abruptly. Then looked between them. Am I interrupting? Nathaniel sighed. Yes. Excellent. Beckett grinned. Charlotte laughed despite herself. The moment dissolved. Yet later, as guests prepared to depart, another development occurred. Lady Ashcombe approached Charlotte personally. Miss Whitmore. Charlotte braced herself. Lady Ashcombe. The older woman studied her carefully. Ignore the gossip. Charlotte blinked. The advice surprised her. Lady Ashcombe smiled. People fear what they do not understand. She glanced briefly toward Nathaniel across the room. And society understands women like you far less than it should. Then she walked away. The words lingered long after the evening ended. Yet the most troubling event came the following morning. A newspaper rested beside her breakfast plate. Charlotte normally ignored society columns. Today one headline caught her eye immediately. A rising favorite in Mayfair? She scanned the article. No names appeared. Yet the references were unmistakable. An intelligent young lady. A powerful duke. Frequent meetings. Growing speculation. Charlotte slowly lowered the paper. Someone was feeding stories to society. Deliberately. Methodically. The rumors were no longer random. They were being encouraged. Across the table, Lady Margaret read the same article. Her expression hardened with every line. Olivia looked increasingly uncomfortable. Edward appeared confused. Charlotte folded the newspaper. A cold realization settled over her. Someone wanted these whispers to spread. The question was why. And judging by the look on her mother's face, she suspected the answer would bring far more trouble than gossip ever could. Charlotte folded the newspaper and set it aside, but the article remained with her long after breakfast ended. Someone was feeding information to society. Not enough to create a scandal outright. Just enough to encourage speculation. The distinction mattered. Random gossip faded. Guided gossip grew. As she rose from the table, Lady Margaret spoke without looking up from her teacup. You will not visit Ravenshire House today. Charlotte stopped. Mother. No. The word arrived with unusual sharpness. Not today. Charlotte studied her carefully. Because of the article. Lady Margaret finally lifted her gaze. Because people are watching. They have been watching for weeks. And now they are writing. Silence settled between them. Edward looked uncomfortable. Olivia stared at her plate. No one seemed eager to continue the discussion. Charlotte understood why. Reputation had become the new battlefield. Yet as she left the room, another thought troubled her more. The article contained details few people should have known. References to meetings. Mentions of inheritance reviews. Descriptions of events that occurred behind closed doors. Someone with access to information was talking. The realization followed her throughout the day. Shortly after noon, a note arrived from Nathaniel. The message was brief. Miss Whitmore, an urgent matter has arisen regarding several trust records. I would appreciate your assistance. Nathaniel Ashcroft. Charlotte stared at the note. Then toward the drawing room where her mother sat receiving visitors. She hesitated only briefly. Whatever was happening had become larger than gossip. An hour later, she entered the library at Ravenshire House. Nathaniel stood near the long table surrounded by documents. Lord Beckett occupied another chair. Several folders lay open before them. The atmosphere felt noticeably different from previous meetings. More serious. More urgent. Nathaniel looked up immediately. Thank you for coming. Charlotte removed her gloves. What happened? Beckett answered first. We found another inconsistency. Charlotte approached the table. Another forged signature. Nathaniel shook his head. Worse. He handed her a document. Charlotte examined it carefully. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. Then she noticed a date. Her eyes narrowed. This amendment was filed after the authorization letter. Exactly. Nathaniel folded his arms. Which should have been impossible. Charlotte reviewed both documents again. The sequence made no sense. One paper referenced authority granted by another document that technically did not yet exist. It was a small detail. Easy to miss. Yet devastating once discovered. Someone altered filing records. Beckett nodded grimly. That is our conclusion. Charlotte felt a chill. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Forged signatures. Contradictory figures. Misdated authorizations. None of it pointed toward carelessness anymore. It pointed toward intention. Nathaniel watched her carefully. There is more. He slid another folder across the table. Charlotte opened it. Her pulse quickened almost immediately. Several names appeared repeatedly throughout the records. Financial advisors. Estate consultants. Administrative reviewers. One name appeared more often than the others. Mr. Leonard Graves. Charlotte frowned. The same advisor connected to struggling families. Including yours, Beckett said quietly. Charlotte looked up. The room felt suddenly smaller. You investigated him. Nathaniel nodded. Extensively. Charlotte lowered her gaze back to the documents. A troubling possibility began forming. What did you find? Nathaniel exchanged a glance with Beckett before answering. Several estates experienced unusual financial complications shortly after accepting his recommendations. Charlotte looked stunned. How many? At least 6. Silence followed. 6 families. 6 separate financial declines. 6 opportunities for manipulation. The implications were staggering. Beckett leaned forward. The problem is proving anything. Charlotte nodded slowly. Suspicion alone accomplished little. Evidence mattered. Always evidence. They spent the next several hours reviewing records. Correspondence. Authorizations. Estate accounts. Piece by piece, a larger picture emerged. Leonard Graves rarely acted directly. Instead, he advised. Suggested. Recommended. Other people signed documents. Other people approved transactions. Yet somehow the results consistently benefited the same network of associates. It was subtle. Sophisticated. Difficult to trace. Which explained why it had survived so long. Late in the afternoon, Charlotte opened a bundle of correspondence tied with faded ribbon. Most letters proved unremarkable. Then one sentence caught her attention. She froze. Nathaniel. Both men looked up. She handed him the letter. Read the 3rd paragraph. He did. Then again. His expression darkened immediately. Beckett moved closer. What is it? Nathaniel passed him the document. Charlotte watched as understanding slowly spread across his face. The letter referenced a land valuation submitted nearly 5 years earlier. One later used to justify significant financial decisions. The problem was simple. The valuation described property improvements that had not yet been built. Silence settled over the library. Finally Beckett exhaled. That is impossible. Charlotte nodded. Unless the valuation was created afterward. Nathaniel looked toward the growing collection of questionable records. Which means someone retroactively altered documentation. Another piece fell into place. Another impossible coincidence vanished. The pattern grew clearer with every hour. Yet the most surprising discovery arrived shortly before sunset. A servant entered carrying newly delivered correspondence. Nathaniel reviewed several letters while Charlotte continued organizing records. Suddenly he stopped reading. Completely. Charlotte. Something in his voice made her look up immediately. He held out a document. "You need to see this." She crossed the room and accepted the paper. It was a financial report. More specifically, a report concerning Whitmore Holdings from nearly 4 years earlier. Charlotte scanned the page, then went still. The recommendation bore Leonard Graves's signature. Beneath it appeared another name. Edward Whitmore. Her father's signature. Charlotte felt all color drain from her face. No. Nathaniel rose immediately. "Charlotte." She shook her head. No. Her father had signed the recommendation. Her father had approved the transaction. Her father had trusted the advisor. Every terrible consequence that followed suddenly became more personal. More painful. Not because Edward was guilty. Because he had been vulnerable. The realization hurt in ways she had not expected. Nathaniel stepped closer. This does not prove wrongdoing on his part. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. I know. It proves he received the same advice as the others. His voice remained calm. Steady. Deliberately reassuring. Charlotte drew a slow breath. Eventually she nodded. Logic returned gradually. Nathaniel was correct. The document suggested manipulation. Not participation. Yet the emotional impact remained. For years she had wondered how her father made so many disastrous decisions. Now she faced the possibility that someone had carefully guided those decisions from the beginning. Beckett quietly left the room to retrieve additional files, giving them privacy without drawing attention to it. Charlotte appreciated the gesture. She sat heavily in a nearby chair. Nathaniel remained standing for several moments before speaking. You are worried about him. Of course I am. Her voice softened. He made mistakes. But he is not dishonest. Nathaniel's expression never wavered. I know. The simple certainty in those 2 words eased something inside her. Not because he agreed. Because he understood. Charlotte looked up. Most people would assume the worst. Most people are lazy thinkers. The answer arrived instantly. Despite everything, she laughed. Nathaniel smiled faintly. Evidence first. Conclusions later. That sounds familiar. I learned from an excellent teacher. Their eyes met briefly. The moment lasted only seconds. Yet something unspoken passed between them. Trust. Respect. Perhaps something deeper neither was ready to name. The library door opened again. Beckett returned carrying another stack of records. You are both going to dislike this. Nathaniel sighed. That statement has become alarmingly common. Beckett placed the document on the table. These were recovered from an administrative archive this morning. Charlotte immediately noticed one detail. Several pages appeared newer than surrounding materials. Different ink. Different paper aging. Her pulse quickened. These were inserted later. Beckett pointed toward her. Exactly what I said. Nathaniel examined the records. His expression hardened. Someone has been rewriting history. The word settled heavily over the room. Because that was exactly what they were discovering. Not isolated fraud. Not random errors. A deliberate effort to reshape records across multiple estates. Including Ravenshire. Including Whitmore. Including families already harmed by financial decline. Outside the windows, evening shadows stretched across London. Inside the library, the mystery finally began revealing its true scale. And as Charlotte stared at the altered documents spread across the table, she realized something unsettling. Whoever orchestrated this scheme had operated successfully for years. Which meant one thing. They would not surrender quietly once someone started uncovering the truth. The announcement arrived 2 weeks later. By then, enough evidence had been gathered to transform suspicion into certainty. Not certainty of every detail. Not certainty of every participant. But certainty that multiple estates had been affected by manipulated records and misleading financial recommendations. The matter could no longer remain private. An estate arbitration hearing would be held in London under the supervision of several respected legal authorities and landholders. Representatives from the affected families would attend. So would Leonard Graves. Charlotte learned of the decision while sitting in Nathaniel's library surrounded by stacks of documents that had become painfully familiar. "It is happening sooner than expected," Nathaniel said. Charlotte looked up from a ledger. "Will they listen?" "They will listen." His expression remained calm. "The question is whether they will like what they hear." Lord Becket, seated across the table, laughed softly. "Based on the evidence, I strongly suspect they will not." Charlotte closed the ledger. The moment felt unreal. Months earlier she had hidden in a small room beneath her family's roof, studying books no one knew she possessed. Now she sat at the centre of an investigation involving some of England's most influential estates. Sometimes the speed of change still left her breathless. "Will my father attend?" she asked quietly. Nathaniel nodded. "He insisted." Charlotte looked away. Edward Whitmore had changed noticeably since learning the truth. The shame he carried had not vanished, but it no longer seemed rooted in personal failure. Gradually he had come to understand that many of his worst decisions had been shaped by carefully crafted advice designed to benefit others. The realization brought relief. It also brought anger. "He deserves answers," Nathaniel said. Charlotte met his gaze. "So do the others." "Yes." Silence settled briefly between them. Then Becket slid another document across the table. "One final review before tomorrow." Nathaniel groaned. "You take great pleasure in tormenting me." "Friendship requires dedication." Charlotte laughed. The sound briefly lightened the room. Yet beneath the humor, tension remained. Tomorrow would change everything. The following morning dawned cool and clear. London appeared washed clean beneath pale sunlight. Carriages lined the street outside the arbitration hall long before proceedings began. Gentlemen arrived carrying portfolios. Solicitors exchanged quiet conversations. Estate representatives moved through the entrance with serious expressions. Charlotte stepped from her carriage and immediately felt dozens of eyes upon her. Some recognized her. Others recognized Nathaniel. A few undoubtedly recognized both. Rumors had not disappeared. If anything, public interest had intensified. Nathaniel noticed her hesitation. "Nervous?" Charlotte adjusted her gloves. "Only rationally." A faint smile touched his face. An encouraging distinction. Together they entered the building. The hearing chamber occupied a large panelled room filled with polished wood, tall windows, and rows of seating arranged around a central table. Several respected arbitrators already occupied their positions. Representatives from affected estates sat nearby. Among them Charlotte recognized Lady Eleanor Hartwell. She smiled warmly when their eyes met. Edward Whitmore occupied another row. His expression brightened immediately upon seeing his daughter. The simple look of trust in his eyes nearly broke Charlotte's heart. Then she saw Leonard Graves. He sat near the far end of the room dressed with impeccable care. Middle-aged. Respectable. Unremarkable. The sort of man society rarely questioned because he appeared exactly as expected. Yet Charlotte had learned an important lesson. Appearances often concealed more than they revealed. Graves noticed her as well. For a brief moment their gazes met. Something cold flickered behind his polite expression. Then it vanished. The hearing began shortly afterward. Initial proceedings moved slowly. Documents were introduced. Timelines established. Financial records reviewed. Witnesses provided explanations regarding valuations, recommendations, and trust amendments. Charlotte listened carefully. Nathaniel remained composed throughout. So did Becket. Piece by piece, evidence accumulated. The pattern emerged clearly. Repeated manipulation. Repeated misinformation. Repeated benefits flowing toward the same network of interests. Several times Graves attempted to dismiss inconsistencies as clerical mistakes. Several times documentary evidence contradicted him. Gradually the atmosphere in the room shifted. Skepticism faded. Concern replaced it. Hours passed. Then came the moment Charlotte had dreaded. One arbitrator adjusted his spectacles and looked toward Nathaniel. "Your Grace, much of this investigation appears to have originated within your estate review." Nathaniel nodded. "Correct. And who first identified the trust discrepancy that began this process?" Silence followed. Charlotte felt her pulse quicken. Nathaniel did not hesitate. "Miss Charlotte Whitmore." Instantly every head turned. The room seemed to narrow around her. One arbitrator looked surprised. Another looked curious. Graves looked annoyed. "Miss Whitmore," one gentleman repeated. Nathaniel's expression remained perfectly calm. "Yes." "The gentleman's daughter." "The same." Murmur spread through the room. Charlotte wanted nothing more than to disappear. Instead she remained seated. Nathaniel continued. "Miss Whitmore identified the original trust vulnerability. She later assisted in uncovering valuation inconsistencies, filing irregularities, and altered records across multiple estates." The room grew quieter with every word. One arbitrator leaned forward. "Miss Whitmore." Charlotte stood slowly. "So, would you be willing to explain how you recognized the original discrepancy?" For a brief moment fear returned. Old fear. Familiar fear. The fear of speaking and being dismissed. Then she remembered something important. That version of her life was over. Charlotte drew a steady breath. "Yes, sir." She explained the clause. The inheritance risk. The precedent that revealed the flaw. As she spoke, confidence gradually replaced anxiety. Facts were safe territory. Facts did not care about social expectations. Several questions followed. She answered each carefully. Another arbitrator requested clarification regarding later discoveries. Charlotte provided it. Then another. And another. The discussion continued for nearly half an hour. By the end, no one looked surprised anymore. They looked impressed. Even more remarkable, they listened. Truly listened. When she finally resumed her seat, a quiet murmur passed through the room. Not ridicule. Respect. Graves appeared increasingly uncomfortable. The evidence continued. Additional records were introduced. Correspondence. Altered filings. Contradictory valuations. One devastating document after another. Eventually the arbitrators requested a response from Graves himself. He rose smoothly. "I regret any confusion these matters may have caused." Charlotte immediately disliked the phrase. Confusion. As though years of manipulation amounted to misunderstanding. Graves continued. "However, many conclusions presented today rely upon interpretation rather than certainty." Several arbitrators exchanged looks. It was not a strong defense. Yet it remained a defense. Then Graves made a mistake. A serious one. He glanced toward Charlotte. "I also question whether conclusions influenced by inexperienced observers should carry equal weight with professional judgment." Silence fell. Charlotte felt the words like a physical blow. Not because they hurt. Because they were predictable. The room remained still. Graves pressed forward. "Miss Whitmore is undoubtedly intelligent. Yet intelligence and expertise are not identical." For one brief moment old humiliation threatened to return. The familiar suggestion that she did not belong. That she should remain quiet while others decided important matters. Then Nathaniel stood. Slowly. Deliberately. The entire room seemed to notice. "I agree completely," he said. Graves blinked. Several arbitrators looked confused. Nathaniel continued. "Intelligence and expertise are not identical." He glanced toward Charlotte. "Miss Whitmore possesses both." Silence. Absolute silence. Nathaniel's voice remained calm. The original discrepancy escaped trained professionals. Miss Whitmore found it. Another pause. The inheritance resolution for Lady Hartwell's estate escaped trained professionals. Miss Whitmore found it. Another. The filing inconsistencies central to this investigation escaped trained professionals. Miss Whitmore found them. No one moved. No one interrupted. Nathaniel's gaze returned to Graves. If competence is the standard, then Miss Whitmore has more than earned her place in this discussion. The room remained silent for several seconds. Then Lady Eleanor Hartwell spoke. Here. A few smiles appeared. One arbitrator nodded openly. Another made a note. Graves sat down without another word. Charlotte stared at the table because looking at Nathaniel felt impossible. Not after that. Not after hearing someone defend her publicly with such certainty. Hours later, as proceedings finally concluded, the outcome became clear. Further investigation would continue. Additional records would be reviewed. Yet the arbitrators unanimously agreed that substantial manipulation had occurred. Graves's recommendations and associated transactions would face comprehensive scrutiny. Several affected estates would receive immediate relief measures, including Whitmore. Relief spread visibly across Edward's face. Lady Margaret, seated nearby, closed her eyes briefly. For the first time in years, hope seemed possible. As attendees began leaving the chamber, conversations erupted throughout the room. Charlotte remained seated, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Then she noticed someone approaching. Lady Margaret. Her mother stopped beside her chair. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Lady Margaret looked toward the gathering crowd. They listened to you. Charlotte blinked. Yes. Another pause followed. Then came words Charlotte never expected to hear. They should have. For a moment neither moved. The statement was small. Quiet. Yet it carried the weight of years. And as Charlotte stared at her mother, she realized the greatest revelation of the day might not involve estates, records, or financial schemes at all. It might be the simple fact that the people closest to her were finally beginning to see what had always been there. For the first time in many years, Whitmore House felt different. The change did not arrive dramatically. There were no celebrations. No grand declarations. No sudden transformation of fortune. Instead, it appeared in small moments. Quiet moments. The kind that often mattered most. 3 days after the arbitration hearing, Edward Whitmore sat in his study reviewing correspondence with a calm Charlotte had not seen in years. Several emergency measures approved by the arbitrators had already eased immediate financial pressure. The estate was not fully secure. Much work remained ahead. Yet disaster no longer stood at the door. Hope had returned. That alone felt miraculous. Charlotte stood near the window holding a stack of ledgers. Sunlight streamed across the room. Dust drifted through warm beams of gold. Her father looked up from his desk. You know, he said suddenly, I still cannot quite believe it. Charlotte smiled. Believe what? Edward leaned back in his chair. That every expert I hired overlooked problems my daughter found almost immediately. Charlotte laughed softly. Not immediately. Close enough. His eyes warmed. I should have listened to you years ago. The words carried no drama. No self-pity. Only honesty. Yet they struck Charlotte more deeply than she expected. For years she had imagined what recognition might feel like. What validation might sound like. Now that it had finally arrived, she discovered something surprising. It was gentler than she imagined. Less triumphant. More healing. A knock sounded at the study door. Olivia entered. Father, Lady Hartwell has arrived. Edward smiled. Show her in. Moments later, Lady Eleanor entered carrying several documents. Her energy seemed entirely different from the exhausted woman Charlotte first met months earlier. Relief suited her remarkably well. Miss Whitmore. She embraced Charlotte warmly before settling into a nearby chair. I have wonderful news. Charlotte sat opposite her. Please tell me. Lady Eleanor held up a letter. The final review of my husband's estate has concluded. Charlotte immediately brightened. And? Lady Eleanor laughed. My son's inheritance rights have been fully confirmed. Charlotte felt genuine happiness sweep through her. That is wonderful. It is. Lady Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed her hand. And it would not have happened without you. Charlotte shook her head. Many people contributed. Yes. Lady Eleanor smiled knowingly. But only one person found the answer. Edward looked remarkably pleased by the exchange. Several months earlier he might have dismissed such praise as polite exaggeration. Not anymore. Later that afternoon, another visitor arrived. Nathaniel Ashcroft. His arrival no longer surprised Charlotte. Yet her pulse still quickened every time she heard his name announced. She disliked how easily he affected her composure. More concerning, she suspected he knew it. Nathaniel greeted Edward and Lady Eleanor before turning toward Charlotte. Miss Whitmore. Your Grace. A familiar warmth passed between them. Quiet. Unspoken. Yet impossible to ignore. Lady Eleanor noticed immediately. Judging by her expression, she found it deeply entertaining. Nathaniel carried several documents. After brief discussion regarding estate matters, the conversation shifted naturally toward ongoing reforms. Several recommendations had already been accepted by interested landowners. Improved record review procedures. Independent verification requirements. Stronger trust oversight. The practical consequences of their investigation continued expanding. Charlotte listened with satisfaction. Facts mattered. Results mattered. Helping people mattered. Yet throughout the discussion she became increasingly aware of something else. Nathaniel seemed distracted. Not worried. Distracted. As though another conversation waited beneath the current one. Eventually Lady Eleanor rose to leave. Edward excused himself shortly afterward to meet with an advisor. Suddenly Charlotte found herself alone with Nathaniel in the drawing room. Silence settled comfortably between them. Neither appeared eager to break it. Finally Nathaniel glanced toward the bookshelf. I owe you an apology. Charlotte blinked. For what? I underestimated the size of your library. She stared. Then laughed. That is your apology. A serious one. His expression remained perfectly composed. I was informed there may be over 400 volumes hidden beneath your roof. Charlotte narrowed her eyes suspiciously. Who informed you? I have sources. Lady Eleanor. Possibly. His amusement was impossible to hide. Charlotte shook her head. Traitor. The easy conversation continued. Books. History. Politics. Architecture. The subjects changed naturally. Yet beneath every exchange flowed something deeper. Familiarity. Trust. Affection. Neither named it. Neither needed to. As afternoon drifted toward evening, Nathaniel's expression gradually became more thoughtful. Finally, he set aside his teacup. Charlotte. The use of her first name immediately captured her attention. He rarely employed it. Yes? For a moment he simply looked at her. Then he spoke quietly. May I ask something personal? Her heart beat faster. You may ask. Your mother. Charlotte blinked, surprised by the direction. My mother. Yes. Nathaniel folded his hands. Why did she work so hard to hide your abilities? The question lingered heavily between them. Charlotte looked toward the window. For a long moment she considered her answer. I used to believe it was because she was ashamed of me. Nathaniel frowned immediately. That makes no sense. I know. A faint smile touched her lips. Now I think it was something else. Nathaniel waited patiently. Charlotte continued. My mother spent years watching our family's position weaken. Watching financial pressures grow. Watching opportunities disappear. She paused. Olivia was beautiful, Charming, socially gifted. Mother believed she represented security. Understanding slowly appeared in his eyes. And you? Charlotte laughed softly. I represented uncertainty. Nathaniel shook his head. You represented the solution. The answer arrived so quickly she almost forgot to breathe. Silence followed. Long silence. Charlotte looked away first. Not because she disagreed. Because she could not think of anything safe to say. Evening shadows stretched across the room. The world outside softened into gold and amber light. Finally Nathaniel rose and crossed toward the window. Charlotte joined him moments later. Together they watched the fading sunlight settle over London rooftops. Neither spoke for several minutes. The quiet felt unusually significant. Then Nathaniel broke it. At the arbitration hearing, one of the arbitrators approached me afterward. Charlotte looked up. Did he? Yes. A faint smile appeared. He asked how I discovered you. Charlotte groaned immediately. Nathaniel laughed. My reaction was similar. What did you say? He turned toward her fully. His expression became serious. Very serious. I told him the truth. Charlotte felt suddenly nervous. And what truth was that? Nathaniel's gaze never wavered. That you are one of the most remarkable people I have ever known. The room seemed strangely still. Charlotte forgot how to breathe. Nathaniel continued quietly. You see things others miss. You solve problems others cannot. You care about people without seeking recognition. His voice softened. And despite everything, you remain kind. Charlotte looked away quickly. No compliment had ever affected her like this. Not because it praised her intelligence. Because it revealed how closely he had been paying attention. The realization touched something far deeper than pride. For a long moment neither moved. Then footsteps approached from the hallway. The spell broke instantly. They stepped apart just as a servant entered carrying correspondence. The interruption was entirely innocent. Yet both seemed grateful for it. After Nathaniel departed later that evening, Charlotte remained awake long after midnight. She sat in her hidden library surrounded by books that had once been her only companions. The familiar room felt different now. Smaller somehow. Not because it had changed. Because her world had expanded beyond it. She thought about her father. Her mother. Olivia. Lady Eleanor. The families they had helped. The lives altered by truth finally coming to light. Then she thought about Nathaniel. About respect. Trust. Friendship. About the way his eyes softened whenever he looked at her. A quiet smile touched her lips. For years she had believed happiness meant being left alone with her books. Now she understood something important. The right person did not pull you away from who you were. The right person saw exactly who you were and valued it. And for the first time in her life, Charlotte allowed herself to wonder whether the future might hold something far more extraordinary than she ever dared imagine. The first snowfall of winter arrived quietly over London. Soft white flakes drifted across rooftops and carriage roads, transforming the city into something gentler than its usual restless self. Charlotte Whitmore stood beside the window of her hidden library beneath the roof and watched the snow settle over Mayfair. Months had passed since the arbitration hearing. Much had changed. The investigation concluded exactly as evidence predicted. Leonard Graves and several associates were exposed for manipulating records, exploiting vulnerable estates, and concealing financial irregularities through carefully crafted documentation. Multiple families recovered losses. Estate protections were strengthened. Public confidence gradually returned. Most importantly, the Whitmore family survived. Not merely financially. Emotionally. The wounds left by years of misunderstanding had begun to heal. Charlotte smiled faintly as she looked around the room. Books still covered every shelf. Notebooks remained stacked across tables. The sanctuary she had built for herself still existed exactly as before. Yet somehow it no longer felt like a place of hiding. It felt like a place of beginnings. A knock sounded at the door. Come in. The door opened. Olivia stepped inside carrying a small tray with tea. Charlotte immediately raised an eyebrow. This is suspicious. Olivia laughed. You say that every time I bring tea. Because you never brought tea before this year. Olivia set the tray down. I am making an effort. Charlotte softened. I know. The truth was remarkable. Her relationship with Olivia had changed more than she ever imagined possible. Once, jealousy and misunderstanding stood between them. Now honesty occupied that space instead. Not perfection. Not instant closeness. Something better. Genuine progress. Olivia handed her a cup. Mother is looking for you. Charlotte smiled knowingly. Should I be concerned? Probably. Olivia's grin widened. She spent nearly 20 minutes deciding which brooch to wear. Charlotte laughed. That does sound serious. Several minutes later, she descended to the drawing room. Lady Margaret stood near the fireplace arranging flowers. The sight alone would have startled Charlotte months earlier. Her mother rarely arranged flowers herself. You wish to see me? Lady Margaret turned. For a moment she simply looked at her daughter. Then she smiled. A real smile. Not a social one. Not a practiced one. A mother's smile. I received a letter this morning. Charlotte sat beside her. Good news. Very good news. Lady Margaret handed her the letter. Charlotte scanned the contents. Several families affected by the investigation planned to establish a charitable legal education fund. The proposal specifically acknowledged her contributions. Charlotte looked up in surprise. This is unnecessary. Perhaps. Lady Margaret's eyes softened. But it is deserved. Charlotte lowered the letter slowly. Years ago, such words would have been unimaginable. Lady Margaret noticed her expression. I owe you an apology. Charlotte froze. Her mother rarely apologized. In fact, she could not remember a single previous occasion. Lady Margaret drew a slow breath. For many things. Silence settled between them. Charlotte waited. I convinced myself I was protecting this family. Her mother's voice remained calm. Sometimes I was. Sometimes I was protecting my fears instead. Charlotte felt emotion tighten her throat. Lady Margaret continued. You were never the problem. The words landed gently. Yet they carried years of pain away with them. Charlotte reached across the small table and took her mother's hand. No dramatic speeches followed. None were needed. Some wounds healed through grand gestures. Others healed through simple truth. That afternoon brought another visitor. Nathaniel Ashcroft arrived shortly before 4 o'clock. Snow still drifted beyond the windows. Servants took his coat and gloves. Moments later he entered the drawing room. Charlotte's pulse reacted exactly as it always did. She found that increasingly annoying. Nathaniel greeted the family warmly. Even Lady Margaret seemed genuinely pleased to see him now. The transformation would have been astonishing to anyone who remembered their first meetings. After tea, Lady Margaret glanced toward the window. Then toward Edward. Then toward Olivia. Charlotte immediately recognized the expression. Her family was plotting something. I believe your father wished to discuss estate improvements, Lady Margaret announced. Edward blinked. Did I? You did. Her tone left no room for disagreement. Olivia nearly laughed into her teacup. Within moments, Charlotte found herself alone with Nathaniel. The drawing room suddenly felt very quiet. Nathaniel appeared equally aware of the situation. Your family has become remarkably transparent. Charlotte smiled. They are trying their best. Apparently. Snow continued falling outside. Firelight flickered warmly across the room. For a few moments neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Familiar. Then Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket. Charlotte immediately grew suspicious. What is that? A document. That answer concerns me. Nathaniel laughed softly. Fair. He withdrew a folded paper and placed it on the table between them. Charlotte stared. Another trust amendment. Not exactly. Should I be worried? Possibly. She narrowed her eyes and opened the document. The moment she read the first lines, confusion appeared. Then surprise. Then complete disbelief. Charlotte looked up. Nathaniel. Her voice barely emerged above a whisper. He remained very calm. Far calmer than she felt. I know. Charlotte looked back down. It was not a legal record. Not an estate document. Not an inheritance review. It was a marriage settlement. Her heart immediately forgot every reasonable rhythm. She looked up again. Nathaniel stood and crossed toward the window. For perhaps the first time since she met him, genuine nervousness appeared in his expression. The realization somehow made the moment even more precious. I spent weeks deciding how to do this. Charlotte could not stop smiling despite her shock. And naturally you chose paperwork. Nathaniel looked almost offended. It seemed appropriate. Charlotte laughed. He smiled in relief. Then his expression softened. Completely. The first time we met, I was told you could barely read. Charlotte's eyes widened. Nathaniel continued. A few days later, you corrected a legal document that several professionals approved. He shook his head gently. That should have been my first warning. Charlotte felt tears threaten unexpectedly. Warning. That I was about to admire someone far beyond my ability to resist. Silence followed. Nathaniel stepped closer. Charlotte, you changed my life. Her breath caught. He continued. You challenged me. Helped me. Made me see things differently. His gaze never left hers. You are the finest person I know. The room blurred slightly. Charlotte realized tears had finally escaped. Nathaniel smiled softly. I had intended to sound more eloquent. She laughed through the tears. You are doing very well. Relief flashed across his face. Then hope. Good. He took her hand carefully. Because I would like to spend the rest of my life proving how serious I am. Charlotte looked at him. Truly looked at him. The man who listened when others dismissed her. The man who respected her mind before he ever loved her. The man who never asked her to become less than she was. The answer had existed for months. Perhaps longer. Yes. Nathaniel blinked. Yes? Charlotte laughed. Yes. The joy that crossed his face was unlike anything she had ever seen. Months later, spring returned to England. Church bells rang across the countryside. Flowers bloomed beneath clear skies. Family and friends gathered beneath the vaulted ceiling of a small chapel on the Ravenshire estate. Charlotte stood beside Nathaniel and exchanged vows with the certainty of someone who had finally found home. Lady Eleanor cried openly. Lord Becket claimed dust had entered his eyes. No one believed him. Edward Whitmore looked prouder than any father in England. Olivia smiled through tears. Even Lady Margaret abandoned dignity long enough to weep quietly into a handkerchief. After the ceremony, celebrations continued across the estate. Laughter filled gardens. Music drifted through open windows. Happiness seemed to touch everyone present. Late that evening, after most guests had retired, Charlotte wandered briefly into Nathaniel's study. She found him standing beside a desk examining a familiar piece of paper. There you are, she said softly. Nathaniel turned. Then smiled. I was looking at something. Charlotte approached. The moment she recognized the document, she laughed. It was the trust amendment. The very first document she corrected. The document that changed everything. Nathaniel carefully folded it again. I could never throw it away. Charlotte slipped her hand into his. Good. Good? It reminds us where this all began. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he kissed her forehead gently and smiled. Outside the windows, evening settled peacefully across the estate. Inside, firelight warmed the room. Years earlier, Charlotte had been the invisible daughter seated quietly near a window while others decided who she was. Now she stood beside a man who knew exactly who she was and cherished every part of it. The girl hidden behind books had never needed to become someone else. She had only needed someone willing to see her clearly. And in the end, that made all the difference.